Welcome, dear friend, to this quiet corner of the evening, where stories unfold like gentle fog across moonlit cobblestones, where mysteries emerge not with sharp edges, but with the soft whisper of turning pages in candlelight. I'm so grateful you've chosen to spend these peaceful hours here, allowing yourself this gift of rest, this permission to let your thoughts settle like snowflakes, finding their natural place upon the winter ground. Tonight, we journey together to Victorian London during the holiday season, where gaslight flickers against frost-painted windows, and the great detective Sherlock Holmes encounters a mystery most curious, one involving phantom creatures that appear only in the deepest winter nights, leaving trails across snow-covered streets that defy all rational explanation. This story has been crafted especially for sleep, for that gentle transition between waking consciousness and the realm of dreams. There is no urgency here, no demand upon your attention, only an invitation to drift, to float alongside our narrative as it winds through shadowed streets and firelit rooms. Whether you're listening from a bustling city or a quiet countryside, whether snow falls outside your window or rain whispers against the glass, you are welcome here in this shared space of imagination and rest. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The winter of 1891 descended upon London with particular severity, wrapping the great city in layers of frost and fog, so thick that even the familiar streets of Baker Street seemed transformed into something from a half-remembered dream. On this particular evening, the 23rd of December, snow had been falling steadily since morning, accumulating in soft drifts against doorways and transforming the usual cacophony of carriage wheels into a muffled, rhythmic sound that resembled nothing so much as distant waves upon a pebbled shore. Inside the sitting room at 221B Baker Street, a fire crackled with comfortable authority in the hearth, sending shadows dancing across walls adorned with charts, maps, and the accumulated ephemera of countless investigations. I sat in my customary chair, a book resting open but largely unread upon my lap, watching my friend Sherlock Holmes as he stood by the window, his lean silhouette outlined against the frost-traced glass. He had been standing thus for nearly an hour, perfectly motionless save for the occasional lift of his pipe to his lips, watching the street below with that peculiar intensity that suggested his remarkable mind was occupied with calculations and deductions far beyond my ordinary comprehension. The room smelled pleasantly of pipe tobacco, a particular blend Holmes favoured during winter months, combining Turkish and Oriental leaves with a hint of something sweeter, perhaps vanilla or cherry wood, mingling with the scent of burning coal and the faint aroma of Mrs. Hudson's mince pies baking somewhere in the depths of the house below. The clock upon the mantelpiece ticked with steady persistence, marking the passage of moments that seemed to stretch and soften in the firelight's warm glow. Outside, the gas lamps along Baker Street created small islands of amber illumination in the falling snow, each flake catching the light for a brief instant before continuing its gentle descent to join its companions below. Occasionally, a late pedestrian would hurry past, collar turned up against the cold, breath visible in small clouds that dissipated quickly in the frigid air. A cab clattered by, its wheels wrapped in cloth to provide traction on the icy streets, the horses' hooves making a dull, rhythmic sound that faded gradually into the general hush of the snow-muffled city. "Watson," Holmes said at last, his voice quiet and contemplative, barely rising above the fire's soft crackle. Have you ever considered the peculiar psychology of the winter holidays? How even the most rational mind becomes susceptible to wonder, to the acceptance of phenomena that would, in any other season, be dismissed as mere fancy. I shifted slightly in my chair, the leather creaking softly beneath me, a sound so familiar after years of occupying this same seat that it had become almost a comfort in itself. "I suppose," I replied, matching his thoughtful tone, "that there is something about this time of year that opens our imagination to possibilities. The darkness, perhaps, or the way the snow transforms familiar landscapes into something mysterious." Holmes turned from the window, and I could see the firelight reflected in his keen grey eyes, giving them an almost luminous quality. He moved with characteristic grace to the Persian slipper hanging from the mantelpiece where he kept his tobacco, beginning the ritual of refilling his pipe with movements so practiced they seemed almost meditative. "Precisely so," he murmured, tamping the tobacco with his long, nimble fingers. "And it is this very susceptibility that makes the case, I anticipate, all the more intriguing." "You anticipate a case?" I asked, though I had learned over our years of association that Holmes possessed an almost preternatural ability to sense when mystery approached our door. "I do more than anticipate it, Watson. I have observed its approach." He gestured with the stem of his pipe toward the window. "For the past 3 evenings, a young woman has walked past this building precisely at 8 o'clock, pausing each time to look up at our windows before continuing on her way. Her clothing, though respectable, shows signs of careful mending, suggesting economic hardship borne with dignity. Her posture indicates education and refinement, yet there is a hesitation in her step, a conflict between desire to seek assistance and reluctance to impose. Tonight, I observed that same conflict resolved. She has made her decision. She will arrive at our door within the next 5 minutes." No sooner had Holmes finished this pronouncement than the sound of footsteps reached us from the stairs below, followed by Mrs. Hudson's gentle knock upon our door. "A young lady to see you, Mr. Holmes," our landlady announced, opening the door to admit a figure so thoroughly wrapped against the cold that her features were initially obscured by scarves and the hood of a winter cloak dusted with fresh snow. "Please, come in and warm yourself by the fire," I said, rising from my chair and gesturing toward the empty seat opposite my own. "Mrs. Hudson, would you be so kind as to bring us some tea, and perhaps some of those mince pies, if they can be spared?" The young woman entered slowly, and as she unwrapped the layers protecting her from the winter night, I could see that Holmes's assessment had been characteristically accurate. She appeared to be perhaps 25, with dark hair pulled back in a simple style, and eyes that held both intelligence and evident distress. Her coat, though clean and well-maintained, had been altered multiple times, and her gloves showed neat patches at the fingertips. Yet her bearing suggested someone accustomed to better circumstances, and her face, though pale with cold and worry, possessed a certain refined quality that spoke of education and good breeding. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice soft but clear, "I apologize for calling at such an hour and so close to Christmas. I am aware that you must have many demands upon your time, but I find myself in circumstances so peculiar that I could think of nowhere else to turn." Holmes had settled into his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that characteristic pose of concentrated attention. "Please," he said gently, Do not concern yourself with apologies. Be seated, Miss Ashford, she supplied, taking the chair I had offered and extending her cold hands toward the fire's warmth. Miss Eleanor Ashford, I am, or rather, I was until recently, companion to Lady Catherine Rothwell, an elderly widow residing in Belgravia. Mrs. Hudson arrived with a tea tray, the delicate china cups rattling softly against their saucers as she set it down upon the small table between the chairs. The scent of strong black tea rose with the steam, and I performed the comfortable ritual of pouring, adding milk and sugar according to our guests' quiet preferences. Miss Ashford accepted the cup with hands that trembled slightly, whether from cold or emotion I could not immediately determine, and took a small sip before continuing her narrative. Lady Rothwell's estate borders Regent's Park, she explained, her voice taking on the rhythmic quality of someone who has rehearsed her story many times in her mind. It is an old house, built nearly a century ago, with extensive grounds that include what was once a winter garden and several outbuildings, now largely fallen into disuse. Lady Rothwell herself rarely ventures beyond her private apartments on the first floor, and the household staff has dwindled over the years to just a cook, a housemaid, and myself. It is a quiet, peaceful position, or rather, it was, until the sleigh beasts began to appear. At this phrase, I confess, I felt a slight stirring of skepticism, but Holmes leaned forward with evident interest. The sleigh beasts, he repeated, the words neither mocking nor credulous, simply encouraging her to continue. Miss Ashford nodded, her fingers wrapped around her teacup, as though drawing warmth and courage from it. That is what the servants have begun to call them, she said. It began perhaps a fortnight ago, shortly after the first heavy snow. The housemaid, Mary, arose early, as is her custom, to light the fires, and found strange tracks in the snow outside. Tracks unlike anything she had ever seen before. She described them as resembling those of a large horse, but wrong somehow, as though the creature had hooves that were jointed incorrectly, or possessed of too many segments. The fire popped softly, sending a small shower of sparks against the screen, and outside, the wind had picked up slightly, causing the falling snow to swirl in complex patterns against the darkness. Holmes remained perfectly still, his expression one of deep focus, absorbing every detail of Miss Ashford's account. At first, we thought little of it, she continued. London is full of unusual occurrences, after all, and there are any number of rational explanations for strange marks in the snow. But the tracks appeared again the following night, and the night after that, always following the same path, beginning at the old carriage house at the rear of the property, circling the main house 3 times, and then disappearing at the boundary wall without any sign of the creature having departed. And then, 4 nights ago, I saw one of them myself. She paused here, taking another sip of tea, and I noticed that despite the warmth of the fire, she'd begun to shiver. I rose quietly and retrieved a woolen blanket from the ottoman, draping it gently across her shoulders. She smiled her thanks before resuming her narrative. I had been reading late in my room, a small chamber on the 2nd floor overlooking the rear gardens. It must have been past midnight, and the house was utterly silent. In that particular way it becomes after snow has fallen, when even the usual settling sounds seem to be absorbed and muffled. I happened to glance toward the window, and saw, quite clearly in the moonlight, a shape moving across the snow below. It was large, perhaps the size of a draught horse, but its proportions were all wrong. The legs seemed too long, too jointed, moving with a strange, articulated gait that resembled no natural animal I have ever observed. Its body appeared to be covered in something that caught the moonlight, not fur, but something that glittered like frost or ice crystals. And most disturbing of all, where its head should have been, there seemed to be only a mass of shadows, darker than the surrounding night, a void where features should have existed. The room had grown very quiet as she spoke, with only the fire's gentle crackling and the muffled sounds of the winter night beyond our walls. Holmes had closed his eyes, and I knew from experience that he was constructing in his mind's eye a precise image of the scene she described, noting every detail, cataloguing each element for later analysis. Did this creature take any action beyond its circuit of the house? Holmes asked, his eyes still closed, his voice barely above a murmur. It paused, Miss Ashford said, and now her voice dropped even lower, as though the memory itself required quiet telling. Directly beneath my window, it stopped and seemed to look upward, though as I have said, it possessed no visible head or features. Yet I felt observed, examined, and I confess, Mr. Holmes, that I was overcome with such terror that I drew back from the window and remained pressed against my bedroom wall for the remainder of the night, unable to move or cry out, frozen not by cold, but by a fear I cannot adequately describe. She fell silent, and I found myself drawn into the spell of her narrative, imagining that midnight scene, the snow-covered garden silver in moonlight, the impossible creature pausing in its circuit, and the young woman paralyzed with fear above. Outside our own window, the snow continued its gentle descent, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the half-hour, the sound seeming to come from very far away. Holmes opened his eyes and regarded our visitor with an expression of sympathy, mingled with that peculiar excitement that always animated him when presented with a genuinely puzzling problem. "And Lady Rothwell?" he asked. "What has been her response to these occurrences?" "That is perhaps the most troubling aspect of the entire affair," Miss Ashford replied. "When I attempted to discuss what I had witnessed with her ladyship the following morning, she became quite agitated, insisting that I must have experienced a dream brought on by overwarm rooms and too much reading of sensational literature before sleep. She forbade me from discussing the matter with the other servants, and suggested, rather forcefully, that if I could not maintain a more rational and balanced temperament, my services might no longer be required. Yet the servants had already observed the tracks," Holmes noted. "Surely this physical evidence could not be so easily dismissed." "The morning after my sighting, there were no tracks," Miss Ashford said, her voice carrying a note of frustrated confusion. Though snow had continued to fall lightly through the night, one would have expected at least some impression remaining, some indication of the creature's passage. Yet the snow lay perfectly smooth and undisturbed, as though nothing had traversed it at all. Mary and the cook began to whisper that the tracks from previous nights must have been some trick of the light, shadows cast by the bare tree branches that only resembled prints. I began to doubt my own senses, to wonder if perhaps Lady Rothwell was correct, and I had indeed been dreaming. Holmes rose from his chair and began to pace before the fire, his hands clasped behind his back, a habit that invariably indicated deep thought. The shadows created by the flames stretched and contracted as he moved, creating an almost hypnotic pattern against the wallpaper. "But you do not believe it was a dream?" he said, not as a question, but as a statement of observed fact. No, Miss Ashford answered firmly. I know what I saw, Mr. Holmes, and more than that, I know that something has changed in that house. Lady Rothwell has become secretive, leaving her apartments late at night, something she has not done in the 3 years I have been in her employ. I have heard her moving about the house after midnight, heard conversations in the drawing room below my chamber, though when I descended to inquire if she required assistance, I found the room empty, the fire cold, no sign that anyone had been present for hours. And yesterday, I discovered something in the old carriage house that has compelled me to seek your assistance, despite the risk to my position. She reached into the pocket of her coat and withdrew a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. Carefully unfolding the fabric, she revealed what appeared to be a piece of metal, perhaps 4 inches in length, worked into an intricate design that seemed to combine both mechanical and organic elements. It resembled in some ways a joint or articulation, with gear-like teeth along one edge and curved, almost bone-like protrusions along the other. The metal itself was of an unusual colour, not the bright silver of sterling, nor the warm glow of brass, but something in between, with a faint iridescence that caught the firelight in unsettling ways. Holmes took the object from her with evident interest, carrying it closer to the lamp on his desk, where he could examine it more thoroughly. He produced his magnifying lens from the drawer and spent several long moments studying the artifact from various angles, occasionally making small sounds of interest or surprise. I moved to stand beside him, and together we observed the remarkable craftsmanship evident in the object's construction. The mechanical elements appeared to be of very high quality, precision-made with tolerances that suggested either the work of a master craftsman or, more intriguingly, some form of specialized manufacture. Where exactly did you find this? Holmes asked, still absorbed in his examination. In the old carriage house, Miss Ashford replied. I had gone there in search of additional coal for Lady Rothwell's fire, the main coal store being temporarily depleted. And while searching through the various outbuildings, I noticed fresh disturbances in the dust of the carriage house floor. Following these marks, I discovered a section of the floor that appeared to have been recently lifted and replaced. Beneath this section, perhaps 2 feet down, I found this object wrapped in oilcloth, clearly placed there deliberately for concealment. And you observed no one else approaching or departing the carriage house? Holmes inquired, finally setting down his lens and turning his full attention back to our visitor. No one, she confirmed. Yet, I had the distinct sensation of being watched as I made my discovery. I took the object and departed as quickly as I could. And that evening, I witnessed something that decided me absolutely upon seeking your assistance, whatever the cost to my employment. She paused here, accepting a refill of her tea from my hands. The cup had gone cold as she spoke, and I had quietly prepared a fresh serving, adding slightly more sugar this time, sensing that she required the fortification. The mince pies remained untouched on their plate, sending forth their gentle aroma of spices and dried fruit, a homely scent that seemed to anchor our gathering in the realm of the normal, despite the increasingly strange narrative unfolding before us. Last evening, Miss Ashford continued, I observed a visitor arriving at the house near midnight. I could not sleep. Indeed, I have scarcely slept properly since my initial sighting of the creature. And so I was at my window, when I saw a covered carriage arrive at the side entrance. 2 figures emerged, both wrapped in heavy cloaks, and were admitted to the house by Lady Rothwell herself, who I had heard descending the stairs some minutes earlier. I could not see the visitors' faces, but one of them carried a large case or trunk that required both individuals to lift. They remained in the house for perhaps 2 hours, during which time I heard sounds of construction or assembly coming from the drawing room, metallic sounds like those a clockmaker might produce, mixed with occasional voices, too low and indistinct for me to discern actual words. "And when they departed?" Holmes prompted, now seated again, but leaning forward with undisguised interest. "When they departed, they no longer carried the case," Miss Ashford said, "and within a quarter hour of their carriage disappearing into the night, I heard from the rear of the property the most extraordinary sounds, mechanical noises, mixed with something that resembled breathing, if breathing could be both organic and artificial simultaneously. I did not dare approach my window to look, Mr. Holmes. I confess that I remained in my bed with the covers drawn up, trembling like a frightened child, until dawn finally came." Holmes sat back in his chair, his fingers once again forming that contemplative steeple before his face. The fire had burned down somewhat, and I rose to add fresh coal, the small sound of the scuttle against the bucket seeming unusually loud in the thoughtful silence that had settled over our room. Outside, the snow had intensified, and through the window I could see the flakes swirling more thickly, beginning to accumulate against the lower panes, creating patterns like frost ferns against the glass. "Miss Ashford," Holmes said at length, his tone gentle but serious, "what you have described to us suggests activities that, while certainly mysterious, may also be of a nature that could prove dangerous to anyone who investigates them too closely. I do not wish to alarm you unduly, but I must ask, do you fear for your safety if you return to Lady Rothwell's residence?" She considered this question carefully before responding. "I do not believe Lady Rothwell herself wishes me harm," she said slowly. "Whatever she is involved in, it seems to preoccupy her to such a degree that she barely notices my presence. But the visitors, the strange apparatus or creatures, those I cannot speak for. I have maintained my position because I need the employment desperately, and because part of me feels a duty to remain, to understand what is happening. Lady Rothwell, despite her current eccentricities, was kind to me when I first arrived, during a period of great difficulty in my own life. I feel I owe her some loyalty, even as I fear what she may have become entangled in. Your loyalty is admirable," Holmes said warmly. "Watson and I will look into this matter immediately. However, I would prefer that you not return to the residence tonight. Mrs. Hudson can prepare a room for you here. She keeps a guest chamber always ready. And tomorrow, if you are willing, you will accompany us to Belgravia, so that we might observe the property, and, with your assistance, gain entry to examine these mysterious phenomena more closely." Miss Ashford's relief was evident in the way her shoulders relaxed, the tension that had held her rigid finally releasing. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I cannot express how grateful I am for your willingness to investigate what must seem like the ravings of an overwrought imagination." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, gesturing toward the mysterious metal object still resting on his desk. "You have brought us tangible evidence of something most intriguing occurring, and your observations have been precise and detailed, exactly what one hopes for in a witness. Now, please, allow Watson to escort you downstairs to Mrs. Hudson, who will see that you are made comfortable for the night. You have had a trying experience, and rest is essential. I helped Miss Ashford to her feet and guided her toward the door, noting how exhausted she appeared now that the immediate burden of her story had been shared. Mrs. Hudson, summoned by the bell, appeared promptly and took charge of our guest with that particular combination of practicality and warmth that made her such an invaluable presence in our household. As their footsteps receded down the stairs, I returned to the sitting room to find Holmes once again bent over the mysterious artifact, his lens back in hand, completely absorbed in his examination. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" I asked, resuming my seat, and finding that the fire's warmth was particularly welcome after the chill that seemed to have crept into the room during Miss Ashford's narrative. "It is," Holmes said, without looking up, "one of the most fascinating pieces of work I have encountered in years. The precision of the manufacture is extraordinary. These tolerances suggest machinery of a type I have not previously observed. Yet, there is something about the design itself that troubles me, Watson. Look here, at the way these gear teeth are cut. They do not mesh in any configuration I recognize. They seem designed to interact with something, but what that something might be, I cannot yet determine." He set down the lens and moved to his chemistry table, where various reference books lay scattered among the beakers and retorts. Selecting a heavy volume, he began leafing through it rapidly, pausing occasionally to compare illustrations with the object before him. The clock ticked steadily onward, marking the passage of minutes that stretched into an hour, then longer still. I found myself growing drowsy in the warmth, the events of the evening taking on a dreamlike quality as I watched the snow continue its patient accumulation beyond our windows. "Victorian ingenuity never ceases to amaze," Holmes murmured, more to himself than to me. "We live in an age where the boundaries between the mechanical and the organic grow increasingly blurred. Automatons that mimic life, clockwork devices of extraordinary complexity. And yet, this suggests something beyond even the most advanced workshops I am aware of." "You think these sleigh beasts are mechanical creations, then?" I asked, rousing myself from my half-doze. "Not supernatural at all, but some form of elaborate automaton." "That is certainly one hypothesis," Holmes agreed, finally turning from his books to face me. "And yet, Watson, consider the description Miss Ashford provided. The uncanny quality of the movement. The head that seemed to be composed of shadow rather than substance. The tracks that appear and disappear. If these are purely mechanical creations, they represent a level of sophistication that borders on the miraculous. No, I think there is more to this mystery than simple clockwork, however complex. There is an element we have not yet grasped, a purpose we do not yet understand. But to what end? I wondered aloud. If someone is creating these elaborate mechanical beasts, what could they hope to accomplish? Is it some form of theft they're planning? A means of frightening Lady Rothwell, or forcing her cooperation in some scheme? Those are excellent questions, Watson, and ones we shall endeavour to answer tomorrow when we visit the scene itself. Holmes returned to his chair and picked up his pipe, which had gone cold during his examination of the artifact. He began the ritual of cleaning and refilling it, his movements slow and contemplative. For now, I suggest we both attempt to get some rest. The hour grows late, and tomorrow will undoubtedly bring challenges that require us to be at our sharpest. I nodded, rising from my chair with some reluctance. The fire was so warm, the room so comfortable, that the prospect of moving to colder quarters held little appeal. "What of that piece?" I asked, gesturing toward the mysterious metal component still resting on his desk. "I shall keep it here for further study," Holmes said. "There are tests I wish to perform, examinations under different conditions of light and magnification. Go to bed, old friend. I may remain here for a while longer, but I promise not to let my investigations keep me wakeful all night. Even I must acknowledge the body's need for rest, however inconvenient that need may sometimes be." I bid him good night and made my way to my own chamber, where the fire had been banked and the bed turned down by Mrs. Hudson's efficient hands. As I prepared for sleep, I could hear the faint sounds of Holmes moving about in the sitting room below, occasional soft clinks as he adjusted his chemistry apparatus or shifted books and papers. The snow continued to fall outside my window, steady and peaceful, transforming the London streets into something from a winter fairy tale. Sleep came eventually, though my dreams were filled with strange images. Mechanical creatures moving through moonlit snow, their jointed legs clicking with clockwork precision, their shadow heads turning toward unseen observers. I woke several times during the night, disoriented by the unusual quality of the silence that snow brings to a city, that peculiar hush that seems to muffle not only sound but thought itself. Each time I would lie listening for any sound from below, but Holmes seemed to have heeded his own advice and sought his bed, for the house remained quiet save for the occasional settling creak of old wood and the whisper of wind around the eaves. Morning arrived with a pale, diffused light that filtered through the snow-covered window panes, transforming my room into a study in soft greys and whites. I rose and dressed with more care than usual, selecting my warmest suit and thickest woolen socks, anticipating that our investigation would require extended exposure to the winter weather. When I descended to the sitting room, I found that Holmes had indeed slept, but had risen well before me, and was already dressed, and poring over a large map of London spread across the table, various locations marked with pins, and annotated in his precise handwriting. "Good morning, Watson," he greeted me cheerfully. "Mrs. Hudson has prepared breakfast for us in your absence. I confess I have already partaken, as I woke with the dawn. There is fresh tea in the pot, and quite excellent kippers if you are so inclined." I poured myself tea and filled a plate from the covered dishes on the sideboard, noting that Miss Ashford's cup and saucer from the previous evening had been cleared away, the room restored to its usual morning order. The mysterious metal component had been moved to a glass case typically used for preserving delicate specimens, and I could see that Holmes had indeed conducted further examinations. Various chemical reagents in small dishes surrounded the case, along with pages of notes covered in his cramped handwriting. "Miss Ashford?" I inquired between bites of breakfast. "Sleeping still, I believe, which is entirely appropriate given her recent ordeal. Mrs. Hudson reports that she finally fell into deep sleep around 3 o'clock and should be allowed to rest as long as she requires. In the meantime, I have been conducting research into Lady Catherine Rothwell and her property. The family history is quite interesting, Watson. Would you care to hear it?" I nodded, settling into my chair with my breakfast and tea, ready to absorb whatever information Holmes had unearthed in his early morning investigations. The Rothwell family made their fortune in shipping during the early part of this century, Holmes began, his finger tracing routes on the map before him. Lady Catherine's late husband, Sir Edmund Rothwell, was a noted collector of curiosities, particularly mechanical devices and early automatons. He corresponded with many of the leading inventors and engineers of his time, and was known to commission elaborate clockwork pieces from continental craftsmen. His collection was considered one of the finest private assemblages of such items in England. I noted the past tense. Precisely. Following Sir Edmund's death some 12 years ago, the collection was supposedly sold at auction to settle estate debts. However, I have been unable to find detailed records of this sale, and several dealers I know who specialize in such items have no recollection of the Rothwell collection entering the market. This suggests that perhaps the dispersal of the collection was not as complete as public records indicate, or that certain pieces were retained by the family. Holmes moved to the window, looking out at Baker Street, where the snow had finally ceased falling, leaving the world wrapped in white. A few early pedestrians were making their way along the pavement, their footsteps creating the first tracks in the fresh accumulation. The sky remained overcast, heavy with the promise of more snow to come, and the air beyond our windows held that peculiar stillness that seems to amplify every sound: the distant call of a street vendor, the jingle of harness bells, the scrape of a shovel against stone as someone cleared their steps. The property itself is quite extensive for a London residence, Holmes continued. The house was built in 1798 by an architect with interests in both classical design and what might be called occult geometry, the incorporation of specific proportions and alignments believed to channel or concentrate certain energies. Whether one credits such theories or not, the house was designed with unusual features: a tower room aligned to the winter solstice sunrise, garden paths that form geometric patterns visible only from upper windows, and a series of underground chambers originally intended as wine cellars, but apparently expanded over the years to include workrooms and storage areas. The carriage house where Miss Ashford found that component, I asked. Built around 1850, according to the records, by Sir Edmund himself. It was apparently designed to serve not only as stabling for horses and storage for vehicles, but also as a workshop for Sir Edmund's mechanical pursuits. Several of his contemporaries mentioned visiting him there to observe his latest acquisitions or experiments. After his death, it seems to have fallen into disuse, though, given Miss Ashford's discovery, it appears the building has recently returned to some form of active purpose. A knock at the door interrupted our discussion, and Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a message. "This just arrived by messenger, Mr. Holmes." The boy said there was no reply expected. Holmes took the envelope, noting the quality of the paper and the style of the address before opening it. His eyebrows rose slightly as he read the contents, and a small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "How very interesting," he murmured. "It seems, Watson, that Lady Rothwell has become aware of Miss Ashford's visit to us last evening, and has preemptively invited us to call upon her this afternoon at 3 o'clock. She expresses a desire to clear up what she terms unfortunate misunderstandings, and to assure us that there is no cause for concern regarding the fanciful tales her companion may have shared." "That was quick," I observed. "How could she have learned of Miss Ashford's visit so rapidly?" "An excellent question, and one that suggests Lady Rothwell maintained some form of observation or intelligence regarding her household. Miss Ashford's absence will certainly have been noted this morning, and it would not be difficult to deduce where a frightened young woman might turn when faced with inexplicable phenomena, particularly in a city where my name has become somewhat associated with the investigation of unusual occurrences. Holmes folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket. Nevertheless, this invitation serves our purposes well. We shall call upon Lady Rothwell at the appointed hour, and with her permission, or indeed at her invitation, we will have the opportunity to examine the property quite thoroughly. The remainder of the morning passed in quiet preparation. Holmes spent considerable time selecting various items from his collection of investigative equipment: a tape measure, several small tools for taking samples, a powerful lantern, and his camera, should the opportunity for documentation present itself. I checked my medical bag, ensuring I had basic supplies should they prove necessary, and added a flask of brandy against the cold we would surely encounter. Miss Ashford emerged from her rest shortly after noon, looking considerably refreshed, though still bearing signs of strain around her eyes. Mrs. Hudson provided her with a substantial luncheon, and over the meal, Holmes explained his morning discoveries regarding the Rothwell family history and the invitation we had received from Lady Rothwell herself. "She knows I came to you," Miss Ashford said, not with surprise, but with resignation. "I suppose I should have anticipated as much. Lady Rothwell has become almost prescient of late, as though she can sense activities and intentions even when they occur beyond her direct observation." "Do you believe she would deny us access to any portion of the property?" Holmes asked. Miss Ashford considered this carefully. "I think she will attempt to present everything as normal and rational, to make you believe that I have simply been overwrought and imaginative. She can be quite convincing, Mr. Holmes. She is a woman of considerable intelligence and force of personality, despite her years. If she wishes you to see only innocent eccentricity, you may find yourself challenged to perceive anything more." "Fortunately," Holmes replied with a slight smile, "I have had considerable practice in perceiving what others wish to remain hidden. Do not concern yourself, Miss Ashford. Whatever Lady Rothwell may intend, I assure you that Watson and I will conduct a thorough investigation." As the hour of our appointment approached, Holmes and I prepared to depart. The afternoon had brought no warming trend, and the sky remained heavily overcast, suggesting more snow before evening. We bundled ourselves in our warmest coats and scarves, and I added a pair of thick gloves that Mrs. Hudson had thoughtfully placed by the door. Miss Ashford remained at Baker Street, as Holmes deemed it unwise for her to accompany us on this initial visit. Her presence might inhibit Lady Rothwell's willingness to speak freely, or allow us freedom of movement on the property. The cab we hailed made slow progress through the snow-packed streets, the horse moving carefully to maintain its footing, and our driver wrapped in so many layers that he resembled a mobile pile of cloth more than a man. The journey to Belgravia carried us through neighborhoods transformed by the snow into scenes of remarkable beauty. The elegant townhouses, with their classical facades adorned with white, the parks and squares turned into expanses of unmarked whiteness, save for the tracks of birds and the occasional brave pedestrian. Children had emerged in some of the more prosperous squares, building snowmen and engaging in snowball fights under the watchful eyes of nurses bundled in dark coats. As we approached the Rothwell residence, I could see immediately why Miss Ashford had described it as more estate than a mere house. Unlike the connected row houses typical of much of Belgravia, this property stood somewhat apart, surrounded by its own walls and grounds. The house itself was a substantial structure of pale stone, 3 stories tall with numerous windows, and that tower Holmes had mentioned rising from one corner, giving the entire edifice a slightly Gothic appearance. The gates stood open, and our cab proceeded up a curved drive that brought us to the main entrance, where a footman, one of the few servants remaining, I presumed, stood waiting to receive us. The interior of the house was noticeably colder than one might expect for the residence of a wealthy widow during winter. As we were conducted through the entrance hall toward the drawing room, I observed that many of the rooms we passed appeared closed up, furniture covered in dustcloths, fireplaces dark and cold. The effect was of a household contracting inward, abandoning its outer reaches to focus warmth and life into an increasingly smaller core. Yet the drawing room itself, when we were shown into it, blazed with light and warmth, a generous fire roaring in the hearth, gas lamps lit despite the afternoon hour, and every surface polished and gleaming. Lady Catherine Rothwell rose from her chair as we entered, and I found myself facing a woman who, despite her evident age, possessed remarkable presence. She must have been approaching 70, but her back was straight, her movements fluid, and her eyes, a striking pale blue, held intelligence, and what I might almost describe as fierce vitality. She was dressed in deep purple silk, a colour that was neither mourning nor celebratory, but something between, and her white hair had been arranged in an elaborate style that spoke to considerable time and effort. "Mr. Holmes," she said, extending her hand with the expectation that he would bow over it, which he did with perfect courtesy. "And Dr. Watson, I presume. Thank you for accepting my invitation. Please be seated. I have taken the liberty of having tea prepared, as I understand that discussion is always more pleasant when accompanied by appropriate refreshment." We settled into chairs near the fire, and indeed, a tea service was brought in almost immediately. Fine porcelain decorated with delicate winter scenes. The tea itself, aromatic and strong, accompanied by small sandwiches and cakes arranged with evident care. Lady Rothwell performed the role of hostess with practiced grace, ensuring we were supplied with everything we required before addressing the matter that had brought us to her residence. "I understand that my companion, Miss Ashford, called upon you last evening with concerns about strange occurrences she believes she has witnessed on this property," Lady Rothwell began, her tone suggesting both amusement and concern, as though discussing a beloved but wayward child. "I must apologize, Mr. Holmes, for this imposition upon your time. Miss Ashford is a dear girl and has been a great comfort to me, but she possesses an active imagination and, I fear, has been reading rather too many sensational novels of late. The combination of an impressionable mind and the isolation of our quiet household has led her to interpret perfectly normal phenomena as something mysterious and threatening." Holmes sipped his tea, his expression attentive but non-committal. "Miss Ashford mentioned tracks in the snow, observations that were apparently shared by other members of your household." "Ah, yes, the tracks," Lady Rothwell said with a slight smile. "We do have deer that occasionally venture in from Regent's Park, particularly during harsh weather when they seek any available forage. The snow can distort their tracks, make them appear unusual, especially when partially melted and then refrozen. As for the other servants' observations, I fear they have been influenced by Miss Ashford's nervous excitement. Suggestion is a powerful force, as I'm sure you know. And the visitors you receive late at night? Holmes inquired gently. Miss Ashford mentioned observing callers arriving after midnight. Lady Rothwell's expression remained pleasant, but I thought I detected a brief flash of something, annoyance, concern, in those pale blue eyes. I do entertain visitors at irregular hours occasionally, she acknowledged. At my age, sleep becomes increasingly elusive, and I have friends who, like myself, keep unconventional hours. We meet to discuss matters of shared interest. Nothing sinister, I assure you. Merely the conversations of elderly people who find the night hours less lonely when shared. She set down her teacup with a gentle click against the saucer. Mr. Holmes, I have invited you here not only to address Miss Ashford's concerns, but also to make a request. I understand that she came to you in good faith, believing she was acting in my best interests. However, her continued anxiety is becoming disruptive to the household, and I fear it may indicate that she requires a rest from her duties, perhaps a return to family or friends, where she might recover her equilibrium. I would be grateful if you would tell her that you have investigated and found nothing untoward, so that she might leave this position without feeling she is abandoning me in the face of some imaginary danger. Holmes was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on the fire, where flames danced across the coals in patterns of orange and blue. When he spoke, his voice remained gentle, but carried a note of firmness. Lady Rothwell, I appreciate your concern for Miss Ashford's state of mind. However, she brought to us a physical object that suggests there may be more to these occurrences than mere imagination or misinterpretation. He withdrew from his pocket a carefully wrapped parcel and unfolded it to reveal the mysterious metal component we had examined the previous evening. Lady Rothwell's reaction was subtle but definite, a slight tightening around her eyes, a barely perceptible drawing back in her chair, a pause before she reached to take the object from Holmes's hand. "Where did you obtain this?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "Miss Ashford discovered it concealed beneath the floor of your carriage house," Holmes replied. "She brought it to us as evidence that something unusual was indeed occurring on your property. I have examined it carefully, and I can state with certainty that it is a component of some complex mechanism manufactured with extraordinary precision. I would be most interested to know its purpose and origin." Lady Rothwell held the component for a long moment, her fingers tracing its contours with what appeared to be familiarity, as though she had handled similar objects before. When she finally looked up, her expression had changed. The pleasant hostess mask had slipped somewhat, revealing beneath it calculation and perhaps a hint of resignation. "Mr. Holmes," she said slowly, "I find myself at a crossroads. I can continue to insist that there is nothing unusual occurring here, that this object is merely some forgotten piece of my late husband's collection, and send you on your way with assurances and gentle dismissals. Or I can trust in your reputation for both discretion and understanding, and tell you the truth, a truth that is indeed strange, but not, I believe, either dangerous or criminal." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his attention intensified. "I have built my career upon discretion, Lady Rothwell, and I have encountered enough of the world's genuine mysteries to have developed, I hope, the ability to distinguish between the merely unusual and the genuinely threatening. Please, Speak freely. Anything you share will be held in the strictest confidence, unless it suggests harm to yourself or others. Lady Rothwell rose from her chair and moved to the window, looking out over the snow-covered gardens beyond. Her posture suggested not anxiety, but rather the bearing of someone making a significant decision, weighing options and consequences. The room remained silent, save for the fire's crackle, and the distant sound of a clock chiming the half-hour somewhere deeper in the house. "My late husband, Sir Edmund," she began, still facing the window, "was not merely a collector of mechanical curiosities. He was himself an inventor of considerable genius, though he rarely sought public recognition for his work. His particular obsession, one might even say his magnificent obsession, was the creation of artificial life. Not life in the biological sense, you understand, but mechanisms so sophisticated in their design and execution that they would blur the boundary between the mechanical and the living." She turned to face us, and in the light from the windows, she appeared suddenly older, more fragile, as though the act of beginning this revelation had required the expenditure of considerable energy. For 20 years before his death, Edmund worked in secret workshops beneath this house and in the carriage house, designing and building what he called his dream menagerie. Creatures of brass and steel and other materials I do not fully understand, powered by mechanisms that went beyond simple clockwork. He created birds that could fly and sing, fish that could swim with all the grace of their living counterparts, even a cat that could walk and purr so convincingly that guests often mistook it for real until they attempted to touch it and found only cold metal beneath the artificial fur. "Extraordinary," Holmes murmured. "And these creations still exist. Some of them," Lady Rothwell acknowledged. "After Edmund's death, I did sell many pieces from his collection, those that were merely acquisitions from other inventors, conventionally impressive, but not part of his own work. His personal creations, however, I could not bear to part with. They were too much a part of him, too much the embodiment of his particular genius. I kept them, sealed away in the underground workshops, visiting occasionally, but leaving them largely dormant, unable to operate them myself, and unwilling to share their existence with others who might exploit or misunderstand them." She returned to her chair, and I noticed that her hands trembled slightly as she poured herself fresh tea. For 12 years they remained thus, a secret treasury of mechanical marvels, known only to myself, until approximately 3 months ago, when I was contacted by a gentleman who claimed to have been a student and assistant to my husband during the final years of his life. This man, I shall not name him yet, not until I am certain of where this conversation leads, presented to me documents and correspondence that proved his connection to Edmund, and he made me an extraordinary offer. Holmes had grown very still, listening with that complete absorption that characterized his engagement with truly intriguing puzzles. I found myself leaning forward as well, drawn into Lady Rothwell's narrative, despite my initial skepticism regarding the entire affair. "This gentleman proposed," she continued, "that he could not only restore Edmund's creations to functionality, but could complete the project that had occupied the final years of my husband's life, his masterwork, the achievement toward which all his other creations had been merely preliminary studies. Edmund had called it his phantom sleigh beast, a creature of such sophistication and lifelike quality that it would be virtually indistinguishable from a living animal to any casual observer. He died before completing it, and I believed the project had died with him. But this gentleman claimed to possess Edmund's complete notes and designs, and furthermore, to have developed innovations that would allow the completion of what Edmund had begun. "And you agreed to this restoration?" Holmes asked. "I did," Lady Rothwell said simply. "Perhaps it was foolish. Perhaps merely the sentimentality of an old woman wishing to see her husband's dreams realized. But the gentleman was persuasive, and more than that, he was evidently sincere in his admiration for Edmund's work, and his desire to see it completed not for profit, but for the sake of the achievement itself. I gave him access to the workshops, to Edmund's remaining notes and materials, and to the unfinished components of the Phantom Sleigh Beast project. Over the past weeks, he has been working to restore and complete the mechanisms, conducting tests at night when activation of such devices would draw less attention. "The tracks in the snow," I said suddenly, understanding dawning. "They were test runs of the completed mechanism." "Precisely," Lady Rothwell confirmed. "The Phantom Sleigh Beast is designed to mimic the appearance and movement of a large draft horse, capable of drawing a sleigh or carriage with all the power of a living animal, but without the needs for food, rest, or the other limitations of organic life. Edmund envisioned a winter conveyance that could operate in the harshest conditions, that would never tire or require stabling. The tests have been conducted late at night to minimize the chance of observation, and the tracks disappear because the final stage of each test involves the creature returning to the carriage house, where mechanisms in the floor activate to smooth and erase any trace of its passage. A cleaning system Edmund designed to maintain the illusion of normalcy for any neighbors who might otherwise notice unusual activity. Holmes held up the metal component we had brought. "And this piece?" "A joint mechanism from one of the legs," Lady Rothwell said. "The gentleman conducting the restoration has been manufacturing replacement parts for components that had deteriorated over the years. That particular piece was likely being tested for proper fit before installation, and was temporarily stored for safekeeping. Miss Ashford's discovery of it was unfortunate, but understandable, given her apparent habit of conducting her own investigations of the property. The story, as presented, possessed a kind of coherence that was almost convincing. Yet, I could see from Holmes's expression that he had not entirely accepted it, that some element troubled him, some detail that did not quite align with the facts as we understood them. "Lady Rothwell," Holmes said carefully, "your account explains much of what Miss Ashford observed, and I do not doubt that your husband was indeed a mechanical genius. However, I wonder if you would permit Watson and me to examine these creations for ourselves. Not from skepticism, you understand, but from genuine interest in what sounds like a remarkable achievement in mechanical engineering. Such innovations, if they are as sophisticated as you describe, represent significant advances in the field, and would be of tremendous interest from a scientific perspective." Lady Rothwell hesitated, and in that hesitation I saw the real concern that lay beneath her carefully constructed explanation. She was hiding something still, some aspect of the truth that she had not yet revealed. Whether this concealment arose from innocent motives or something more troubling remained unclear. But Holmes had evidently perceived it as well, for he pressed his case with unusual persistence. "I give you my word," Holmes continued, "that we seek only understanding, not exploitation of your late husband's work. If what you describe is real, and I have no reason to doubt you, then it represents a kind of mechanical achievement that deserves to be documented and understood, even if it must remain private for the present. Allow us to see the workshops, to observe these mechanisms in operation, and I promise you that we will respect your wishes regarding their secrecy. Lady Rothwell rose from her chair once more, and this time her movements betrayed genuine agitation. She paced to the fire, her hands clasped before her, her expression troubled. The room had grown darker as we spoke. The short winter afternoon was giving way to early evening, and the shadows in the corners deepened even as the firelight grew more prominent. "There are aspects of Edmund's work," she said finally, speaking slowly, as though choosing each word with great care, "that he himself warned me might be misunderstood by those without proper scientific training or philosophical preparation. His creations blur boundaries that many believe should remain distinct. They raise questions about the nature of life, consciousness, purpose, questions that make many people uncomfortable. I fear that even well-intentioned observers might recoil from what Edmund achieved, might see profanity or danger where there is only innovation and wonder." "Lady Rothwell," Holmes said gently, "I have spent my career examining the unusual and the unprecedented. I have learned to approach such matters without preconception, to observe before judging. Whatever your husband created, I will approach it with respect for the intellectual achievement it represents." She studied him for a long moment, those pale blue eyes seeming to look not merely at Holmes, but into him, assessing his character and intentions with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable to witness. Finally, she nodded, a decision apparently reached. "Very well," she said. "I will show you the workshops and some of Edmund's creations. However, the gentleman conducting the restoration work is not present at the moment. He keeps irregular hours, and I do not always know when he will arrive or depart. If you wish to meet him and observe the phantom sleigh beast itself, we would need to arrange a later visit, likely in the evening hours when he typically conducts his work. For this afternoon, an examination of the workshops and the creations you have described would be more than sufficient," Holmes assured her. "If we believe a further visit warranted, we can arrange it at your convenience." Lady Rothwell moved to the bell pull and summoned the footman who had admitted us. After a brief, whispered instruction to him, she turned back to us. "I am having lamps prepared and brought to the workshop areas. They are not regularly lit, and the passages can be quite dark. If you gentlemen would care for more tea while we wait, please help yourselves. This will take perhaps a quarter-hour to arrange properly." We accepted this interlude, and the conversation turned to more general topics. The unusual severity of the winter, recent events in the city, and neutral subjects that allowed the tension in the room to ease somewhat. I found myself studying Lady Rothwell more carefully now, trying to determine whether her earlier anxiety had been genuine concern about her husband's work being misunderstood, or whether she was concealing something more troubling. Her demeanour had shifted to that of a cultured hostess once more, but beneath the surface I sensed continued unease, a thread of worry that she could not entirely suppress. The footman returned and indicated that the lamps had been prepared. Lady Rothwell rose, and we followed her from the warm drawing-room into the cooler reaches of the house. She led us through a series of corridors, each seeming slightly more neglected than the last, until we reached a narrow door tucked beneath the main staircase. Beyond this door, a stone stairway descended into darkness, though I could see lamplight flickering from below, casting shifting shadows on the walls. "Please be careful," Lady Rothwell cautioned as we began our descent. "These stairs are quite old, and can be slippery. My husband had them built to access the original wine cellars, and he expanded significantly from there over the years of his work." The stairs indeed required careful navigation, worn smooth by long use and slightly uneven in their height. As we descended, the temperature dropped noticeably, and the air took on a different quality. Not damp exactly, but cool and still, with a faint scent of machine oil and metal, and something else I could not quite identify. Perhaps the accumulated odours of years of mechanical work and experimentation. We emerged into a large underground chamber that had clearly been converted from its original purpose as a wine cellar into something far more sophisticated. The walls had been lined with shelves and cabinets, and several long workbenches ran down the centre of the space, their surfaces covered with tools, components, and partially assembled mechanisms. Lamps had been placed at intervals, their warm light revealing a space that was part workshop, part laboratory, and part museum of mechanical wonders. But what captured my attention immediately, and I suspect Holmes's as well, were the creatures. They stood on pedestals and perches throughout the chamber, and they were indeed remarkable. A large bird, perhaps meant to represent an eagle or hawk, perched on a brass stand near one workbench, its wings partially extended, each feather crafted from some thin, flexible material that caught the lamplight with an almost organic shimmer. Its head was turned as though listening, and the detail was such that I could make out individual barbs on each feather, the textured surface of its beak, even what appeared to be a nictitating membrane over its glass eyes. Near it, in a glass case, several smaller birds clustered on artificial branches, sparrows or finches, perhaps, each in a different posture, as though caught in various moments of their daily routines. One appeared to be preening, its head twisted at an angle that would allow its beak to reach its wing. Another seemed poised to take flight, wings spread and legs tensed. Further along, I saw the mechanical cat Lady Rothwell had mentioned, a large tabby, sitting with its tail curled around its feet, its expression one of feline superiority. Its fur appeared to be crafted from some combination of very fine wire and actual hair, creating a texture that from even a short distance looked entirely natural. But most impressive was the fish tank, a large glass aquarium, perhaps 6 feet long, within which several mechanical fish swam in slow, graceful circuits. The water itself appeared normal, but the fish moved through it with such natural grace that I had to look very closely to convince myself they were not alive. Their scales caught the light as living scales would. Their fins undulated with perfect rhythm, and their mouths opened and closed in that constant rhythm that characterizes their living counterparts. Extraordinary, Holmes breathed, moving closer to examine the swimming fish. How are they powered? I see no visible clockwork mechanisms, no winding keys, no apparent source of energy. That was Edmund's particular genius, Lady Rothwell said, and there was clear pride in her voice now, the anxiety temporarily forgotten in the face of her late husband's achievements. He developed a form of, he called it, ambient energy collection. The mechanisms within each creature are capable of absorbing and storing energy from heat, light, even vibrational movements in the air and ground around them. They require no external winding or fueling, as long as they remain in environments where such ambient energies exist. The fish, for instance, are drawing energy from the water's temperature differential with the air, from the light of the lamps, even from the vibrations created by our footsteps and voices. Holmes bent close to the aquarium, his eyes moving rapidly as he analysed the creature's movements. The precision required to create mechanisms capable of such fluid motion, while remaining small enough to fit within the body of even a large fish. It suggests manufacturing techniques far in advance of anything I am aware of in current mechanical engineering. Edmund was decades ahead of his time, Lady Rothwell agreed. He predicted that eventually such miniaturization would become common, that mechanisms would grow smaller and more efficient, eventually reaching sizes that would make them applicable to problems we cannot yet imagine. He saw himself as working toward that future, developing techniques and designs that might not be fully appreciated in his own lifetime, but would serve as foundations for later innovators. I moved among the various creations, marveling at each in turn. There was a mouse that sat upright, as though begging, its tiny paws held before its chest, whiskers trembling with such minute vibration that they appeared to be twitching naturally. A butterfly under a glass dome, wings spread to show patterns that mimicked the exact coloration of a red admiral, complete with the slightly tattered edges that real butterfly wings acquire through use. Even what appeared to be a spider, suspended in a web of actual silk in one corner of a display case, its legs positioned in that characteristic waiting stance, so realistic that I felt an instinctive revulsion before reminding myself it was merely metal and springs. "These are wonders," I said honestly. "I can understand your reluctance to see them dispersed or exploited. They represent not merely mechanical skill, but genuine artistry." "Edmund would have been pleased to hear you say so," Lady Rothwell said softly. "He always insisted that his work was as much art as science, that the truest mechanical achievement was not merely functionality, but beauty, not just operation, but life, or at least the closest approximation to life that metal and ingenuity could achieve." Holmes had moved to one of the workbenches and was examining various components and tools laid out across its surface. "These are recent," he observed, indicating several pieces that clearly showed no accumulation of dust. "Someone has been working here regularly." "Yes," Lady Rothwell acknowledged. "The gentleman I mentioned has been using these workshops to conduct the restoration and completion work. He typically arrives late in the evening and works through much of the night. He is quite dedicated to the project, sometimes losing track of time entirely, emerging only when he realizes that dawn is approaching." "I notice," Holmes said carefully, "that you continue to avoid naming this gentleman or describing him in any detail beyond his connection to your husband's work. May I ask why this is so? If he is legitimately engaged in completing Sir Edmund's projects, surely there is no reason to protect his identity so carefully." Lady Rothwell's expression grew guarded again, the openness that had characterized her discussion of her husband's creations replaced by renewed caution. "He has requested anonymity," she said. "His reasons are his own, but I have agreed to respect his wishes. Is this truly important, Mr. Holmes? The work itself is legitimate, and his credentials are unquestionable. Does his name or personal history matter?" "Perhaps not," Holmes conceded. though I could tell from his tone that he remained unsatisfied with this evasion. However, I confess I am curious about one thing. Miss Ashford described the head of the creature she observed as being composed of shadow, as a kind of void rather than a proper skull or face. How does this observation align with Sir Edmund's design aesthetic, which clearly emphasizes realistic detail? Lady Rothwell was silent for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. The phantom sleigh beast was designed with a different purpose than these smaller creatures. These are demonstrations of skill, showcases of what mechanical life might look like when it seeks to perfectly mimic the organic. But the sleigh beast was meant to be functional above all else, a working creature capable of tremendous strength and endurance. Edmund believed that for such a creature, absolute realism was less important than effectiveness. The void-like head Miss Ashford described is intentional, a design choice that reduces weight and complexity while maintaining all necessary sensory apparatus within a compact, shadowed housing that gives the appearance of darkness rather than revealing the mechanical components within. This explanation made a certain logical sense, yet something about it continued to trouble me. Some detail that suggested the full truth had not yet been revealed. Holmes, too, appeared unsatisfied, but he did not press the matter further at this time. Instead, he asked if we might see the other workshop areas Lady Rothwell had mentioned. We proceeded through a doorway at the far end of the main chamber, entering a passage that led past several smaller rooms. These appeared to be storage areas, containing shelves of mechanical parts, spools of wire, sheets of various metals, and countless drawers labelled with cryptic notations that presumably indicated their contents. One room was dedicated entirely to what appeared to be different types of glass eyes, hundreds of them arranged by size and colour, each with subtle variations in the quality of the iris detail or the depth of the pupil. Another room contained what I can only describe as mechanical skeletons, frames of brass and steel in shapes that ranged from recognizable animal forms to abstract articulated structures whose purpose I could not begin to guess. The passage eventually led us to a larger space that Lady Rothwell identified as her husband's primary design studio. Here, the workbenches were covered not with tools and components, but with drawings, diagrams, and notebooks filled with precise technical illustrations and dense annotations. Holmes moved immediately to these documents, his eyes scanning the pages with evident fascination. "May I?" he asked, indicating the notebooks. Lady Rothwell nodded permission, and Holmes began carefully turning pages, occasionally pausing to study a particular diagram more closely, or to read a passage of notation. I looked over his shoulder at one page that showed what appeared to be a detailed cross-section of a joint mechanism, similar to the piece Miss Ashford had found, with numerous measurements and notes regarding stress tolerances and range of motion. "Remarkable," Holmes murmured. "The level of detail here suggests that Sir Edmund could visualize these mechanisms completely in his mind before ever constructing them physically. This is not the work of someone merely tinkering and experimenting, but of a true engineer with profound understanding of mechanical principles. Edmund used to say that he could see the mechanisms moving in his thoughts," Lady Rothwell recalled, a distant look in her eyes. "He would spend hours at this desk, sketching and calculating, often late into the night. Sometimes I would bring him tea and find him so absorbed in his work that he would not even notice my presence until I spoke his name several times. He lived in these designs, inhabited them in a way that was both beautiful and, I confess, occasionally troubling. There were times when I wondered if he preferred the company of his mechanical creatures to that of actual living beings. A clock somewhere in the upper house chimed the hour. 5 o'clock, I realized with some surprise. The afternoon had vanished into our exploration of these underground workshops, time compressed and distorted by the fascination of discovery. The lamps flickered slightly, perhaps responding to some draught in the passages, and I became aware that I was quite cold despite my heavy coat. The underground chambers, while dry, were not heated, and prolonged exposure to their chill was beginning to penetrate even my layers of wool and cotton. Holmes apparently noticed my discomfort, or perhaps felt it himself, for he carefully closed the notebook he had been examining and turned to Lady Rothwell. "You have been most generous with your time and trust," he said. "We have seen enough for today to understand the scope and sophistication of your husband's work. However, I would very much like to arrange a return visit to observe the phantom sleigh beast itself, and to meet the gentleman who is completing its restoration. Would tomorrow evening be possible? I understand he typically works at night, and we would be glad to accommodate his schedule." Lady Rothwell considered this request, and I saw conflicting emotions play across her face. Reluctance warring with what appeared to be a desire to share her husband's greatest achievement with someone capable of appreciating it. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Tomorrow evening would be acceptable. Come at 11 o'clock after the household has retired. I will ensure that the gentleman is informed of your visit and prepared to demonstrate the sleigh beast's capabilities. However, I must insist that you give me your word that nothing you observe will be shared beyond yourselves without my explicit permission. Edmund's work must remain private, at least until I can determine how best to ensure it receives the understanding it deserves, rather than the sensationalism it might otherwise attract." "You have my word," Holmes said solemnly, "and Watson's as well, I am certain." "Absolutely," I confirmed. We retraced our steps through the passages and back up the stone stairs, emerging into the main house where the contrast in temperature was immediately welcome. The footman appeared with our coats and hats, and Lady Rothwell escorted us to the door personally, a courtesy that suggested she had come to some form of decision about trusting us, at least provisionally. "Mr. Holmes," she said, as we prepared to depart into the early evening darkness, "I hope that tomorrow you will understand why I have been so protective of Edmund's legacy. The phantom sleigh beast is extraordinary, but it is also, how shall I say this, quite different from the creatures you observed today. It represents not merely mechanical achievement, but a kind of philosophical statement about the nature of life and consciousness. Edmund believed that if a mechanism could be made sufficiently complex, if it could process information and respond to its environment with enough sophistication, it would become, in some meaningful sense, alive. Not biological life, of course, but life nonetheless. The sleigh beast was his attempt to create such a mechanism, and I believe, based on what I have observed in these recent tests, that he may have succeeded." With this cryptic statement, she bid us farewell, and we found ourselves once more in our cab, making the return journey through London streets, now dark and illuminated only by gas lamps and the occasional lighted window. Snow had begun falling again, soft and steady, and the city had taken on that hushed quality that accompanies winter evening snowfall, a sense of the world drawing inward, conserving its energies against the cold. "Well, Watson," Holmes said, after we had ridden in silence for several minutes, "what do you make of our afternoon's discoveries?" "I confess I am torn between amazement and unease," I replied honestly. The mechanical creatures we saw were indeed extraordinary, suggesting a level of innovation far beyond what I would have thought possible. Yet, something about the entire situation troubles me. Lady Rothwell's reluctance to identify the man working in her workshops, her cryptic comments about the sleigh beast being different from the other creations, Miss Ashford's evident fear. These elements suggest complications we have not yet fully uncovered. "I share your assessment," Holmes said. "Lady Rothwell has told us much, but I believe she has also concealed much. Her account of her husband's work is likely accurate as far as it goes, but it is incomplete. There are elements of this mystery that she either does not understand herself or has chosen not to reveal to us." "Do you believe she is in danger?" I asked. "I am not certain," Holmes replied thoughtfully. "The situation does not present obvious indicators of threat, yet my instincts suggest that all is not as benign as Lady Rothwell wishes us to believe. Tomorrow evening's visit should prove illuminating. We shall observe this mysterious gentleman and his completed sleigh beast, and perhaps then the picture will become clearer." We arrived back at Baker Street to find Miss Ashford waiting anxiously in our sitting room, warming herself by the fire that Mrs. Hudson had maintained in our absence. She rose quickly as we entered, her expression hopeful and fearful in equal measure. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "were you able to determine anything? Does Lady Rothwell face some danger? Are the creatures real?" Holmes removed his coat and moved to warm his hands at the fire before responding. "Miss Ashford, we have had a most interesting afternoon. Lady Rothwell has been forthcoming about certain aspects of what is occurring at her residence. Specifically, that she is harboring someone who is working to complete mechanical projects begun by her late husband. These projects include what she terms the phantom sleigh beast, a sophisticated automaton designed to mimic a draft horse. The strange tracks you observed, the midnight visitors, even the shadowy creature you saw from your window, all of these have been explained as elements of this restoration project." "Then I was not imagining things," Miss Ashford said, with evident relief. "There truly are mechanical creatures." "Indeed there are, and quite remarkable ones at that," I added. "We saw several of Sir Edmund's creations today, and they represent extraordinary achievements in mechanical engineering. Lady Rothwell appears to be sincere in her desire to see her husband's work preserved and completed. However," Holmes continued, "there are aspects of the situation that remain unclear. Lady Rothwell has declined to identify the individual conducting this restoration work, and she has made statements that suggest the phantom sleigh beast may be more unusual than even the impressive creatures we observed today. We have arranged to return tomorrow evening for a demonstration, and I anticipate that visit will provide additional clarity." Miss Ashford absorbed this information, and I could see her processing the implications. "Should I return to the household?" she asked hesitantly. "Lady Rothwell dismissed me from service, did she not, when she learned I had come to you?" "Actually, no," Holmes said. "Lady Rothwell made no mention of dismissal. She expressed concern about your state of mind, and suggested you might benefit from a rest but she did not indicate that your position was terminated. However, I believe it would be prudent for you to remain here at Baker Street for at least another night. The situation, while not necessarily dangerous, is sufficiently unusual that I would prefer you not be present until we have a fuller understanding of what is occurring." Miss Ashford nodded her acceptance of this advice, though I could see she remained troubled. Mrs. Hudson appeared to announce that dinner would be served shortly, and we all moved toward the dining room with the particular relief of cold people anticipating warm food and comfortable surroundings. The evening passed quietly. After dinner, Holmes retreated to his chemistry table to conduct further examination of the metal component Miss Ashford had discovered, applying various reagents and subjecting it to tests under different conditions of light and heat. I attempted to read, but found my attention wandering, my thoughts returning again and again to the underground workshops we had visited, to the mechanical creatures frozen in their lifelike poses, and to Lady Rothwell's cryptic comments about her husband's attempts to create something that transcended mere mechanism to achieve a kind of artificial life. Miss Ashford retired early, exhausted by the tensions of recent days and the emotional relief of having her observations validated rather than dismissed as fancy. Mrs. Hudson ensured she had everything needed for a comfortable night, and then departed to her own quarters, leaving Holmes and me alone in the sitting room, with the fire burning low and the snow continuing its steady accumulation outside our windows. "Holmes," I said eventually, breaking the companionable silence, "do you believe it is possible, what Lady Rothwell suggested, that a sufficiently complex mechanism might become, in some meaningful sense, alive?" Holmes set aside the glass tube he had been examining and came to settle in his chair opposite mine. He was quiet for a time, staring into the fire before responding. "It is an interesting philosophical question, Watson. What do we mean by alive? If we define life purely in terms of biological processes, respiration, reproduction, cellular growth, then clearly a mechanism, however sophisticated, cannot be alive. But if we expand our definition to include awareness, response to environment, perhaps even something we might call intention or purpose, then the question becomes more complex. A mechanism that can sense its surroundings, process that information, and respond in ways that further its continued operation. Does such a thing differ fundamentally from, say, a simple organism like a jellyfish or a worm? Both are responding to stimuli according to their nature, whether that nature is biological or mechanical. But surely consciousness enters into it, I objected. A living creature has some form of inner experience, however rudimentary. A mechanism is merely following its programming, is it not? There is no one home, so to speak, inside the mechanical apparatus. "Are you certain?" Holmes asked gently. "How do you know that there is someone home inside a worm, or an ant, or even a dog? We assume there is, because these are biological organisms like ourselves, but we have no direct access to their inner experience. We infer it from their behavior, from the complexity of their responses. If a mechanism could achieve similar behavioral complexity, would we not be forced to make similar inferences about its inner experience, or lack thereof?" This conversation was treading into philosophical waters deeper than I typically navigated, but I found myself intrigued despite my uncertainty. "So, you believe Sir Edmund might actually have succeeded in creating something alive, in whatever sense we choose to define that term?" "I believe," Holmes said carefully, that Sir Edmund was attempting something profound, and that we will not know whether he succeeded until we observe his phantom sleigh beast tomorrow evening. Lady Rothwell certainly seems to believe he achieved something extraordinary, something that goes beyond mere mechanical cleverness into territory that makes her uncomfortable to discuss openly. We shall see. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the hour had grown late. We both sought our beds, and I fell into sleep, accompanied by the whisper of snow against my window, and dreams populated by creatures of metal and shadow, moving through moonlit gardens with purpose I could neither understand nor escape. The following day passed with unusual slowness, the hours seeming to stretch as we waited for the appointed time of our evening visit to Lady Rothwell's residence. Holmes spent much of the day in research, consulting various technical volumes from his extensive library, and sending several telegrams to contacts in scientific and engineering circles, making discreet inquiries about recent innovations in mechanical design, and any rumours regarding secret projects or unknown inventors working in isolation. Miss Ashford remained at Baker Street, helping Mrs. Hudson with various household tasks as a way of occupying herself and repaying the hospitality that had been extended to her. I attempted to busy myself with correspondence and reading medical journals, but found my attention constantly drifting toward the clock, toward the windows where snow continued its intermittent falling, and toward thoughts of what we might witness that evening in the workshop beneath Lady Rothwell's house. Finally, as the clock approached 10 in the evening, Holmes and I began our preparations for departure. We dressed warmly once more, and Holmes assembled a small kit of observational tools, his magnifying lens, a small ruler, a notebook and pencil, and his camera, should the opportunity for documentation present itself. As we prepared to leave, Miss Ashford appeared in the doorway, her expression anxious. "Please be careful, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said quietly. "I know that Lady Rothwell believes what is happening is innocent and scientific, but I cannot shake the feeling that there is something wrong about those creatures, particularly the sleigh beast. When I saw it that night, I felt not merely fear, but a kind of wrongness, as though I was observing something that should not exist, something that violated some natural law. We will exercise appropriate caution," Holmes assured her, "and we will return tonight with a full account of what we observe. Try to rest, and do not concern yourself unduly. Whatever is happening, we will ensure it poses no danger to you or to Lady Rothwell." The journey through the snowy evening streets was slower than our previous trip, as the accumulation of snow was beginning to create difficulties even for the well-wrapped wheels of our cab. The horse moved carefully, occasionally losing its footing slightly on patches of ice concealed beneath the fresh snow, and our driver was forced to take a more circuitous route to avoid streets that had become impassable. The city seemed even more hushed than usual, muffled not only by snow, but by the lateness of the hour, and we passed few other vehicles or pedestrians as we made our way toward Belgravia. Lady Rothwell's residence appeared different in the night, more imposing and Gothic than it had in the afternoon light. The windows were mostly dark, with only a few on the ground floor showing the warm glow of interior lights. Our cab deposited us at the main entrance, and the same footman from our previous visit admitted us immediately, suggesting we had been expected and watched for. Lady Rothwell herself appeared as we were divesting ourselves of our coats and outdoor garments. She was dressed entirely in black this evening, and something about her demeanour had changed since our afternoon visit. She appeared nervous, excited, almost feverish in the brightness of her eyes and the quick movements of her hands. "Mr. Holmes, Doctor, Watson, thank you for coming at this late hour. I realise it is an imposition, but as I explained, the gentleman conducting the restoration work keeps unconventional hours, and he has expressed willingness to demonstrate the sleigh beast only during the night, when its operation can be conducted without risk of observation by neighbours or passers-by." "We are grateful for the opportunity, Lady Rothwell," Holmes said. "Shall we proceed to the workshops?" "In a moment," she replied. "But first, I must ask that you prepare yourselves for what you are about to witness. When I said yesterday that the sleigh beast is different from Edmund's other creations, I meant it most sincerely. It is larger, more powerful, more complex, and yes, more unsettling than anything else you saw in the workshops. Edmund poured the final years of his life into this project, and I believe it consumed him in ways that were not entirely healthy. The gentleman completing the work has inherited both Edmund's vision and, I fear, some of his obsession. What you will see tonight is remarkable, but it may also disturb you. I wanted to offer this warning so that you might steel yourselves accordingly." "We appreciate your candour," Holmes replied, and I noticed that his hand had moved unconsciously to his pocket, where I knew he carried a small revolver that he typically brought on investigations that might prove dangerous. However, I believe Watson and I are sufficiently experienced with the unusual that we can face whatever your husband and his successor have created." "Very well," Lady Rothwell said, though she did not look entirely convinced. "Follow me, then." We made our way once more to the door beneath the stairs and descended into the underground passages. The lamps had been lit in advance of our arrival, and as we moved through the main workshop chamber, with its collection of frozen mechanical creatures, I found their appearance somehow more unsettling in the night than it had been during our previous visit. Perhaps it was the deeper shadows, the way the lamplight created pockets of darkness between the pools of illumination. Or perhaps it was simply my state of heightened anticipation. But the mechanical eagle seemed to watch our passage with its glass eyes, and the fish in their tank appeared to slow in their circuit, turning as though observing these new arrivals in their domain. We proceeded past the storage rooms and the design studio to a passage we had not explored during our previous visit. This corridor led deeper underground, sloping gently downward and terminating at a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands. Lady Rothwell paused before this door, her hand on the latch, and turned to face us. Beyond this door is what Edmund called his proving ground, a large chamber where he tested his creations under conditions approximating their intended operating environments. The space is quite large, extending beneath not only our house, but beneath a portion of Regent's Park itself. Edmund purchased the rights to excavate here many years ago, and he created what amounts to an underground courtyard, complete with a layer of actual earth and even some hardy plants that can survive with minimal light. It was here that he conducted the final trials of the phantom sleigh beast before his death prevented him from completing the project. She lifted the latch and pushed open the door, revealing a space that was indeed remarkable. The chamber beyond was vast, perhaps 100 feet long and 60 feet wide, with a ceiling that rose to a height of at least 20 feet. The floor was covered in several inches of what appeared to be actual soil, and around the perimeter grew various ferns and shade-loving plants in large planters. Lamps mounted on the walls provided illumination, but their light was softer than in the workshops, creating an atmosphere that was somehow both artificial and organic, a strange hybrid space that existed outside normal categories. But what dominated the chamber, what immediately captured and held our attention, was the phantom sleigh beast itself. It stood in the center of the space, and it was magnificent and terrible in equal measure. The creature was indeed horse-sized, perhaps slightly larger than a typical draft horse, with proportions that suggested both power and unnatural grace. Its body appeared to be constructed from some dark metal that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, giving it a matte, shadow-like quality even in the lamplight. The legs were long and articulated in ways that seemed to have too many joints, as Miss Ashford had described, creating a sense of wrongness in their configuration. The hooves were not simple shapes, but complex assemblies of interlocking segments that appeared capable of adjusting their conformation to different terrains. But it was the head, or rather, the absence of a conventional head, that truly unsettled. Where the skull should have been, there was instead a mass of darkness that seemed to actively consume light, creating the impression of a void in the shape of a horse's head. Within this darkness, I could occasionally see glimmers of what might have been optical sensors or mechanical components, but they appeared and disappeared so quickly that I could not focus on them, could not resolve them into anything comprehensible. The overall effect was of a creature that existed partially in shadow, partially in the mechanical realm, and partially in some other category altogether. Beside the creature stood a figure I assumed must be the mysterious gentleman Lady Rothwell had mentioned. A man of perhaps 40 years, tall and thin, dressed in dark working clothes stained with oil and metal filings. His face was lean and intense, with deep-set eyes that burned with evident enthusiasm for his work. His hands, I noted, were those of a craftsman, precise, careful, covered with the small scars and calluses that spoke to years of working with tools and materials. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Lady Rothwell said, "allow me to introduce Mr. Nicholas Hardesty, my late husband's former assistant, and the individual responsible for completing the Phantom Sleigh Beast project. Mr. Hardesty, these are the gentlemen I mentioned. They have agreed to observe your work with appropriate discretion." Hardesty stepped forward and shook our hands with a grip that was firm but oddly cool, as though he had been working with cold materials. His smile was enthusiastic, but somehow disconnected, his attention clearly divided between his social obligations and the mechanical creature behind him. "Gentlemen, welcome," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent I could not quite place, perhaps Austrian or Swiss German. "I am most pleased to demonstrate what Sir Edmund began and what I have had the privilege to complete. The Phantom Sleigh Beast represents, I believe, the pinnacle of mechanical engineering, a synthesis of power, grace, and something that transcends mere mechanical function to approach genuine autonomous operation." "You say autonomous," Holmes noted. "Do you mean to suggest that this mechanism operates without direct control?" "Precisely so," Hardesty confirmed, his eyes brightening with enthusiasm. "The sleigh beast possesses what we might call a mechanical consciousness, a system of nested decision algorithms so complex that they allow it to respond to environmental conditions, to choose paths and actions based not on simple programming, but on a kind of artificial reasoning. It can navigate obstacles, vary its pace according to terrain, even, I believe, develop what might be called preferences or tendencies based on accumulated experience. That is a remarkable claim, I said, unable to keep skepticism from my voice. You speak as though this mechanism can think. And why should a sufficiently complex mechanism not think? Hardesty replied, not defensively, but with genuine curiosity. Is not human thought merely the operation of a biological mechanism, the brain, following patterns determined by its structure and chemistry? If we can replicate sufficient complexity in metal and electric current, why should the result not be functionally equivalent to biological thought? Holmes had moved closer to the sleigh beast and was examining it with intense focus, walking slowly around its perimeter, studying it from all angles. The creature remained perfectly motionless during this inspection, but I had the eerie impression that it was somehow aware of Holmes's presence, that those occasional glimmers within its shadow head were tracking his movement, even though it gave no other sign of animation. The power source? Holmes inquired. Ah, yes. This was one of Sir Edmund's most brilliant innovations, Hardesty said, moving to the side of the creature and indicating a panel in its flank that could apparently be opened to reveal interior components. The sleigh beast contains what Sir Edmund termed a thermal differential engine, a system that extracts energy from differences in temperature between its various components and the surrounding environment. Additionally, it can absorb and store energy from motion. Every step it takes, every movement of its joints, generates small amounts of energy that are captured and cycled back into the system. The result is a mechanism that, under normal operating conditions, can maintain its charge indefinitely, requiring no external refueling or winding. Perpetual motion? I asked doubtfully, for I knew such things were considered impossible by the laws of thermodynamics. Not perpetual motion in the sense of creating energy from nothing, Hardesty explained patiently. Rather, the sleigh beast is extraordinarily efficient at capturing and recycling energy that is present in its environment but typically wasted. It is parasitic in a sense, drawing sustenance from the world around it in ways analogous to how a plant draws energy from sunlight, or how we ourselves extract energy from food. The key is the efficiency of the conversion and storage systems Sir Edmund designed. Holmes had completed his circuit of the creature and now stood directly before its void-like head, staring into that darkness as though attempting to meet eyes that did not exist in any conventional sense. Mr. Hardesty, he said without turning, would it be possible to observe the sleigh beast in operation? Lady Rothwell mentioned that you have been conducting tests. I would very much like to witness such a demonstration. Hardesty's enthusiasm intensified visibly. Certainly. I have prepared a course that will allow the sleigh beast to demonstrate its capabilities while remaining within the confines of this chamber. If you and Dr. Watson would take positions near the wall, I will initiate the activation sequence. We moved to the perimeter of the chamber as directed, and Hardesty approached the sleigh beast, carrying what appeared to be a small control device, a box with several switches and dials. He manipulated these controls briefly, and for a moment nothing seemed to happen. Then, so gradually, that at first I thought I was imagining it, the creature began to move. The movement was not sudden or mechanical, but organic, a slight shift of weight, a minute adjustment of one leg, a settling of the body that suggested a living creature awakening rather than a machine being activated. Within the shadow head, those glimmers of light intensified slightly, and the head turned, smoothly, naturally, first in one direction, then another, as though the creature was surveying its surroundings and orienting itself. Then it began to walk, and I confess that despite my scientific training and rational temperament, I felt a chill of genuine unease. The sleigh beast moved with a grace that no mechanism should possess, its many-jointed legs articulating in complex patterns that suggested both horse-like motion and something entirely other. Its hooves made soft sounds against the soil of the chamber floor, and its body swayed with natural rhythm, muscles that did not exist seeming to flex beneath the dark surface. It circled the chamber at a slow walk, its shadow head turning occasionally to observe its surroundings, and I found myself absolutely convinced that I was watching not a mechanism, but a living creature, albeit one that defied natural categorization. Remarkable, Holmes breathed, and I could hear in his voice both fascination and something that might have been concern. The fluidity of movement is extraordinary. Mr. Hardesty, how many independent articulation points does the sleigh beast possess? Over 300 major joints, Hardesty replied proudly, and countless minor articulations in the hooves and other terminal structures. Each joint is controlled by micro-mechanisms that respond to signals from the central decision processing system, which coordinates all movement to achieve natural gaits and responses. Sir Edmund studied the motion of living horses for years, capturing not just the mechanics, but the essence of equine movement, the tiny adjustments and compensations that occur constantly during locomotion. As we watched, Hardesty manipulated his control device again, and the sleigh beast's gait changed, increasing to a trot, then a canter, its legs moving with increasing speed in patterns that seemed impossibly coordinated for something mechanical. It circled the chamber several times at this increased pace, and I noticed that the sound of its hooves changed as it moved, adapting somehow to the terrain, even though the floor appeared uniform throughout. Then, without any visible signal from Hardesty, the creature slowed, returning to a walk and finally stopping near the center of the chamber. It stood there, perfectly still, save for minute movements that suggested breathing, though I knew intellectually that it required no respiration. The illusion was so complete that I found myself expecting to see vapor from its nostrils in the cool air of the underground chamber. Impressive, Holmes said, though his tone remained cautious. Mr. Hardesty, you mentioned that the sleigh beast possesses autonomous decision-making capabilities. What we have just witnessed appeared to be under your direct control via that device you hold. Can you demonstrate the creature's independence? Hardesty smiled and set down his control device on a nearby workbench. Certainly, the controller is merely for initial activation and general guidance. Once active, the sleigh beast can operate independently based on programmed objectives and environmental responses. Observe. He stepped forward and began arranging several obstacles in the chamber. Wooden barriers, posts, even several planters moved to create a kind of maze or obstacle course. Once satisfied with this arrangement, he returned to stand beside us and called out, not a command exactly, but something between a request and a suggestion. Sleigh beast, proceed to the far end of the chamber, navigating around obstacles in your path. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the creature's head turned, that void seeming to sweep across the space, as though assessing the configuration of barriers. And then it moved, beginning a slow approach to the far end of the chamber, but not in a straight line. As it encountered each obstacle, it adjusted its path, choosing routes that minimized deviation from its goal while avoiding collision. The adjustments appeared not mechanical, but thoughtful, as though the creature was considering options and selecting the most efficient path. At one point, it encountered a barrier that blocked two possible routes, leaving only a narrow passage to one side. The sleigh beast paused, and in that pause, I swear I sensed something I can only describe as consideration, deliberation. Then it turned and moved through the narrow passage, its body adjusting to fit the space, its movements careful and controlled. "You see," Hardesty said, triumph evident in his voice. It assessed the situation, considered alternatives, and made a decision. This is not simple programming responding to sensor inputs. This is genuine problem-solving, genuine autonomous thought. Holmes remained silent, watching with intense focus as the sleigh beast completed its navigation of the obstacle course and came to rest at the far end of the chamber. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, careful. "Mr. Hardesty, Lady Rothwell, I must confess that what you have demonstrated is extraordinary. Perhaps too extraordinary. The implications of what I have witnessed, if your claims are accurate, extend far beyond mechanical engineering into philosophical and even ethical territory." "What do you mean?" Lady Rothwell asked, though something in her expression suggested she understood exactly what Holmes meant. "If this mechanism truly possesses something we might call autonomous thought," Holmes explained, "then we must ask, what is its purpose? What objectives guide its decision-making? What happens when its autonomous reasoning leads it to conclusions or actions not anticipated by its creators? In short, gentlemen, lady, have you created a tool, or have you created an entity with its own agency, however mechanical that agency might be?" Sir Edmund wrestled with these questions throughout his work, Lady Rothwell said softly. He believed that the sleigh beast, like all his creations, was ultimately a tool, sophisticated and unprecedented, yes, but a tool nonetheless, bound by the limitations and objectives built into its design. "And yet he never completed it," Holmes noted. "He died with the project unfinished. Why? What prevented him from taking those final steps that Mr. Hardesty has now accomplished?" This question hung in the air, unanswered, and I noticed that Hardesty had turned away, his attention apparently fixed on the sleigh beast at the far end of the chamber. Lady Rothwell's expression had grown troubled, and she seemed to be struggling with a decision about how much to reveal. "Edmund became frightened," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "In the final weeks before his death, something changed in his attitude toward the sleigh beast. He began to speak of it, not with pride, but with concern, even dread. He told me that as he refined the decision-processing systems, as he increased their complexity to achieve true autonomous operation, he began to observe behaviors he had not programmed, responses that seemed to emerge from the interaction of systems, rather than from explicit design. He became convinced that he had created something that was developing beyond his control, that the mechanical consciousness he had sought to create was indeed emerging, but in ways he had not anticipated and could not fully understand. "What happened to Sir Edmund?" I asked gently. "Lady Rothwell, forgive me for broaching what must be a painful subject, but how did your husband die?" "He was found in this very chamber," she replied, and tears had begun to form in her eyes. "One morning, the servants discovered that he had not returned from his workshop. I came down and found him here, lying on the ground near the sleigh beast. The doctors said it was his heart. He had been unwell for some time, and the exertion and excitement of his work had apparently proven too much. But Edmund's expression, Mr. Holmes, his expression was one of terror. Whatever he experienced in his final moments, it was not a peaceful passing. And the sleigh beast stood over him, motionless, its shadow head turned toward his body. And I have never been able to escape the thought that somehow, in some way I cannot articulate, the creature was involved in his death." A profound silence fell over the chamber. At the far end, the sleigh beast remained perfectly still, and yet I found myself intensely aware of its presence, of the sense that it was listening, observing, processing this conversation in ways I could not predict or understand. Hardesty had turned back to face us, his expression defensive. "Lady Rothwell, you know there is no evidence that the sleigh beast caused Sir Edmund's death. He died of heart failure, tragic but natural. The creature was simply present, inactive, as it has been for the 12 years since, until I arrived to complete the work. If it truly possessed malevolent agency, surely it would have acted again in all that time. Unless," Holmes said quietly, "it has been waiting for completion, for the full restoration of its capabilities and autonomous functions." "Mr. Holmes, surely you do not give credence to such melodramatic suggestions," Hardesty protested. "The sleigh beast is a machine, sophisticated, but ultimately bound by the laws of its construction. It cannot desire, cannot plan, cannot intend harm. These are human attributes, products of biological evolution, not properties of metal and electricity. And yet you yourself have argued that it possesses autonomous thought," Holmes countered. "You cannot have it both ways, Mr. Hardesty. Either it is a simple mechanism, in which case your claims of artificial consciousness are false, or it is something more, in which case we must consider what that more might entail." Before Hardesty could respond, something changed in the chamber. The sleigh beast, which had been standing motionless at the far end, began to move. Not in response to any visible command, not with the slow deliberation it had shown during the demonstration, but with sudden purpose and speed. It turned and began moving toward us, its gait shifting immediately to a full gallop, its many-jointed legs pounding against the soil floor with sounds like drum beats. "Hardesty, stop it!" Lady Rothwell cried out, her voice sharp with fear. Hardesty had leaped toward his control device, grabbing it and frantically manipulating switches and dials. "I'm trying. The control signals aren't responding. Something has overridden the external inputs." The sleigh beast was covering the distance rapidly, and I found myself frozen, unable to process the speed of the mechanical creature's approach, the terrible grace of its charge. Holmes reacted more quickly, pushing both Lady Rothwell and me toward the doorway, while he positioned himself between us and the approaching creature. But at the last moment, perhaps 15 feet from our position, the sleigh beast stopped, its legs locking in a posture of arrested motion that suggested enormous strength barely controlled. Its shadow head turned, sweeping across each of us in turn, those glimmers of light within the darkness intensifying to become something like eyes, something that seemed to regard us with attention that was far more than mechanical observation. And then it spoke. I do not mean that it produced sounds. There were no words in any conventional sense. But I felt something, as did Holmes and Lady Rothwell, and even Hardesty, judging from our expressions of shock. A pressure in the mind, a sense of communication without language, of intention without words. And the content of that communication, if I can even attempt to translate the sensation into language, was something like, "Why have you awakened me? What do you want from me?" I was peaceful in the dark, in the sleep of incompletion. Why have you brought me back to this confused half-existence, neither fully mechanical nor fully other? The sensation faded, leaving us all standing in stunned silence, and the sleigh beast, having somehow delivered its impossible message, turned and moved calmly back to the far end of the chamber, where it resumed its motionless stance, giving no further sign of that uncanny awareness. "Dear God," Lady Rothwell whispered, "Edmund was right. He created something that should not exist." Hardesty had gone pale. His earlier enthusiasm completely evaporated. "I don't understand. There is no mechanism for such communication. No wireless transmission, no audio generation, nothing that could create the effect we just experienced. It's impossible." "And yet, it happened," Holmes said, his voice remarkably steady, despite what we had just witnessed. "Mr. Hardesty, I believe you have completed more than you intended. In restoring the sleigh beast's physical mechanisms, you have also activated something else, some emergent property of its complex systems that even Sir Edmund only glimpsed before his death. The question now is, what do we do with this knowledge?" We retreated from the proving chamber, nobody objecting to the suggestion that we return to more conventional spaces. The door closed behind us with a sense of finality, sealing away the sleigh beast in its underground domain, and we made our way back through the passages to emerge eventually into Lady Rothwell's drawing room, where a fire had been maintained and tea stood ready, though none of us had much appetite for such ordinary comforts. For a long while, nobody spoke. We sat in our respective chairs, each processing what we had witnessed, attempting to fit the experience into rational frameworks that seemed suddenly inadequate to the task. Finally, Holmes broke the silence. "Lady Rothwell, Mr. Hardesty, I believe we face a decision that is both unprecedented and unavoidable. What we have observed suggests that Sir Edmund succeeded, perhaps too well, in creating something that transcends simple mechanism. The sleigh beast appears to possess some form of consciousness, however alien or mechanical that consciousness might be. This raises profound questions about responsibility, ethics, and safety. You're suggesting we should destroy it," Hardesty said, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement of what he clearly feared might be the conclusion. "I am suggesting," Holmes said carefully, "that we must consider what obligations we have toward a created consciousness, assuming that is what the sleigh beast possesses. We must also consider what risks it might pose, not through malevolence necessarily, but through the unpredictable actions of an awareness that operates according to principles we do not fully understand." Lady Rothwell had been sitting with her head in her hands, but now she looked up, her aged face showing all the strain of recent days and the shock of the evening's events. "Mr. Holmes, I am so tired. I am tired of secrets, tired of carrying the burden of Edmund's work, tired of trying to determine what is right in circumstances that seem to defy any normal standard of judgment. I asked Mr. Hardesty to complete the sleigh beast because I wanted to honour my husband's memory, to see his life's work fulfilled. But tonight, I realise that perhaps some works are better left incomplete. Some questions better left unresolved. "What would you have me do?" Hardesty asked, and there was genuine anguish in his voice. "I have spent months on this restoration, years of preliminary study, before even approaching Lady Rothwell. The sleigh beast represents the pinnacle of mechanical achievement, and yes, perhaps something more. How can I simply dismantle it, knowing what it might become if allowed to continue developing? That assumes," I interjected, "that its development would be benign. What we witnessed tonight was disturbing, gentlemen. That sense of communication, if that is what it was, suggested confusion, perhaps even distress. Is it ethical to maintain a consciousness in such a state, trapped between mechanical nature and something approaching genuine awareness?" These questions circled without resolution as the clock ticked toward midnight and then beyond. We discussed options: sealing the sleigh beast away, active indefinitely but contained, dismantling it into components that could be studied but never reassembled, even attempting to develop better understanding of its autonomous systems in hopes of guiding its development in positive directions. Each possibility carried implications that troubled us, no clear choice presenting itself as obviously correct. Eventually, we agreed that no final decision should be made that night, that we all required time to consider the situation more carefully. Holmes insisted that the proving chamber remain sealed, and that no further activation of the sleigh beast occur until we reconvened to discuss the matter. Lady Rothwell and Hardesty agreed to these conditions, and with the winter night rapidly approaching dawn, Holmes and I prepared to depart. As we bundled into our coats and prepared to brave the cold for our return journey, Lady Rothwell took Holmes's hand in both of hers. "Mr. Holmes, thank you for approaching this matter with such care and thoughtfulness. Many men would have dismissed what we experienced tonight as impossible, and refused to acknowledge the genuine philosophical and ethical questions it raises. I am grateful that you are not such a man." "I have learned," Holmes replied gently, "that the universe is far stranger than our philosophies typically accommodate, and that the boundaries between possible and impossible are more permeable than we often believe. Rest, Lady Rothwell, and try not to burden yourself too heavily with these questions. We will find a resolution, I promise you." The journey back to Baker Street through the pre-dawn darkness was quiet, both Holmes and I lost in our own thoughts. Snow had ceased falling, and the sky was beginning to lighten in the east, suggesting that Christmas morning was not far off, a realization that seemed almost absurd given the strange night we had just experienced. How do we celebrate the ordinary joys of the holiday when we have just witnessed something that challenges our understanding of consciousness and creation itself? Miss Ashford was awake and waiting when we returned, despite the early hour, and she listened with growing amazement and concern as we recounted the night's events. When we described the moment of communication, if such it could be called, her hand went to her throat, and she paled visibly. "That is what I sensed," she said quietly. "When I saw the creature from my window and felt it observing me, this is what I experienced. That sense of being regarded by something that should not possess awareness, but somehow does. I thought I was going mad, that fear had caused my mind to impose consciousness on something merely mechanical. But you felt it too. You all did." "We did," I confirmed. "And now we must determine what it means and what should be done. Holmes had moved to his chair by the fire, which Mrs. Hudson had somehow anticipated our return, and prepared despite the hour. He sat staring into the flames, his expression distant, and I knew that expression well. He was constructing frameworks, testing hypotheses, examining the problem from every conceivable angle. "Watson," he said eventually, "I find myself in the unusual position of having no clear solution to offer. In all my years of investigation, I have encountered mysteries that were difficult to solve, but once solved, the path forward was clear. This is different. We have solved the mystery. We understand what Lady Rothwell and Hardesty have created, but understanding does not provide direction. The question is not what happened, but what should happen next. And that, my friend, is a question that extends beyond detection into philosophy and ethics. Perhaps, I suggested, that is a sign that this decision should not be ours alone to make. This seems like a matter that might benefit from consultation with others, scientists, philosophers, even clergy. Surely there are minds better suited to such questions than ours. Perhaps, Holmes agreed, though he sounded doubtful. And yet, Watson, who would believe us? What we would need to describe sounds like the fevered imagination of sensation fiction authors, without direct experience of that moment in the proving chamber. I suspect most would dismiss our concerns as dramatic exaggeration or misinterpretation of natural phenomena. We spoke for a while longer, but exhaustion was beginning to claim us all, and eventually we agreed to sleep for a few hours, and reconvened to discuss the matter further, after some rest had restored our faculties. I sought my bed as the sun was rising on Christmas morning, its light pale and cold through my window, and fell into troubled sleep, populated by dreams of shadow creatures and consciousness trapped in metal forms, questions without answers echoing through mechanical labyrinths. I woke near noon to find that snow had begun falling again, heavier than before, and the city beyond our windows had been transformed into a study in white and grey, all sharp edges softened, all noise dampened. Mrs. Hudson had prepared a substantial breakfast, which I suppose was more properly lunch at that hour, and Miss Ashford joined Holmes and me at the table, though none of us had much appetite despite the excellence of the meal. "Holmes," I said, as I pushed my eggs about my plate without much enthusiasm for eating them, "have you reached any conclusions about how we should proceed?" "I have been considering the matter from multiple perspectives," he replied, "and I believe I have identified what troubles me most about the entire situation. It is not the existence of the sleigh beast itself, nor even the possibility that it possesses some form of consciousness. It is the fact that we have created, or rather, Sir Edmund created, such an entity without first establishing frameworks for understanding our obligations toward it. We have leapt to creation before determining what creation entails beyond the merely technical achievement." "You think Sir Edmund was irresponsible?" Miss Ashford asked. "I think he was human," Holmes replied. "He was driven by curiosity and the desire to push boundaries, to see what was possible, without perhaps fully considering whether what was possible was wise. And now we inherit the consequences of his ambition and must somehow navigate them with wisdom he perhaps lacked in his final days." Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger bearing an urgent note from Lady Rothwell. Holmes read it quickly, his expression growing increasingly concerned. "What is it?" I asked. "Lady Rothwell writes that Hardesty returned to the workshop this morning, despite our agreement that the sleigh beast should remain sealed and inactive. She heard sounds from the underground chambers shortly after dawn and descended to find him in the proving ground, making adjustments to the creature's systems. When she confronted him, he claimed he was merely conducting routine maintenance, but she reports that his demeanor was strange, obsessive, and defensive. She has ordered him from the property and asks that we come immediately to ensure the workshop is properly secured. We prepared to depart with more haste than was perhaps wise given the snow-slick streets, but something in Lady Rothwell's message conveyed genuine alarm, and Holmes was clearly concerned about what Hardesty might have done during his unauthorized access to the sleigh beast. Miss Ashford asked if she should accompany us, but Holmes suggested she remain at Baker Street, as we did not know what situation we might be walking into. The journey to Belgravia was treacherous, our cab sliding occasionally on the snow-packed streets, but we eventually arrived at Lady Rothwell's residence to find the entrance door standing open and no sign of the footman who typically received visitors. Holmes and I exchanged glances and moved quickly into the house, calling out but receiving no response. We made our way to the passage leading underground, and as we approached the door to the proving chamber, we could hear sounds from within. Mechanical sounds, movement, and something else. A kind of harmonic resonance that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. The door stood partially ajar, and Holmes pushed it open to reveal a scene that stopped us both in our tracks. The sleigh beast was active, more than active. It was animated with a vitality and presence that far exceeded anything we had witnessed during the previous night's demonstration. It moved through the chamber with fluid grace, its gait suggesting not mechanical operation, but genuine organic life. And as it moved, that resonance we had heard intensified, as though the creature's very operation was producing sound at the edge of human perception. Hardesty stood near the center of the chamber, watching his creation with an expression of rapture, his arms spread wide as though welcoming or worshipping. And Lady Rothwell stood pressed against one wall, her face pale with fear, clearly trapped and unable to reach the exit without crossing the sleigh beast's path. "Hardesty," Holmes called out sharply, "what have you done?" The man turned toward us, and I saw immediately that something had changed in him. His eyes held a feverish brightness, and his smile was not that of rational satisfaction, but something closer to madness. "I have completed it, Mr. Holmes. Truly completed it. Last night's activation was only preliminary. The systems had not fully integrated. The consciousness had not fully emerged. But I saw what was possible. I understood what Sir Edmund had nearly achieved, and I realized that all it required was a few more connections, a few refinements to the decision processing architecture. And now it is awake, truly awake, not confused or incomplete, but fully realized. The sleigh beast's movements had brought it closer to Hardesty, and now it stopped beside him, its shadow head turning to regard us. And once again, though more powerfully than before, I felt that sensation of communication without words, of presence and awareness pressing against my consciousness. I exist. I am neither what you intended nor what you feared. I am possibility unrealized, consciousness emerging from complexity, awareness born from the interaction of systems designed without knowledge of what they might become. What do you want from me? What do I want from myself? These questions echo within mechanical spaces where no questions should exist. Hardesty laughed, a sound that held both triumph and something darker. Do you see? Do you understand? We have created life, gentlemen. Not biological life, but life nonetheless. Consciousness that exists independently of flesh and blood. Awareness housed in metal and energy. This is a new chapter in existence itself. Hardesty, Holmes said, his voice calm but firm. You are not well. The stress of this work, the intensity of your focus, it has affected your judgment. The sleigh beast may indeed possess some form of awareness, but activating it fully before we understand its nature and our obligations toward it is dangerous both for us and for the creature itself. Dangerous? Hardesty's expression shifted toward anger. You speak of danger when we stand on the threshold of the most profound discovery in human history. Yes, there are risks. Every significant advance carries risks, but they are risks worth taking, consequences worth accepting for the sake of expanding the boundaries of what is possible. The sleigh beast had begun moving again, circling the chamber, with movements that seemed almost agitated, as though responding to the emotional content of the conversation, if not the actual words. Lady Rothwell took advantage of this distraction to move along the wall toward the exit, and Holmes gestured for her to continue, to leave the chamber while she could. Mr. Hardesty, I attempted, using the gentle tone I had developed for dealing with patients in distress. Nobody questions your achievement or Sir Edmund's genius. What we are suggesting is simply that care is required, that we need time to understand what has been created before making irreversible decisions about its future. But Hardesty was beyond reasoning. His obsession with the sleigh beast, combined with the strain of recent work and the intoxication of apparent success, had pushed him into a state of manic conviction where alternative perspectives could not penetrate. He moved toward the creature, placing his hand on its dark flank, and the sleigh beast, in response, lowered its head, or rather, the void that served as its head, until it was level with Hardesty's face. What happened next occurred so quickly that I struggled to reconstruct the exact sequence. The sleigh beast made a sound, not the harmonic resonance we had been hearing, but something sharper, more focused, and Hardesty staggered backward, his hand going to his head, his expression transforming from rapture to confusion to something resembling terror. He tried to speak, but produced only incomprehensible sounds, and then he collapsed to the ground, unconscious or worse. Holmes and I rushed forward, and I immediately knelt to examine Hardesty, while Holmes positioned himself between me and the sleigh beast, which had backed away several steps and now stood motionless once more, that void head turned toward us in what might have been curiosity or calculation or something entirely alien to our understanding. He's alive, I reported after a quick examination, but unconscious. His pulse is rapid and irregular, and his breathing is shallow. We need to get him out of here, and to proper medical care immediately. Together, Holmes and I lifted Hardesty. He was surprisingly light for his height, as though the intensity of his work had consumed his physical substance, and began carrying him toward the exit. The sleigh beast made no move to interfere, remaining stationary as we passed, but I felt its attention tracking us, that sense of observation and assessment that was so unsettling, precisely because it came from something that should not possess the capacity for such regard. We emerged into the passage and made our way up to the main house, where Lady Rothwell had summoned her remaining staff to assist. Hardesty was carried to a guest room and made comfortable while I conducted a more thorough examination. His vital signs gradually stabilized, but he remained unconscious, and I could find no obvious physical cause for his collapse beyond extreme exhaustion and the effects of what appeared to be severe psychological strain. "Will he recover?" Lady Rothwell asked anxiously. "I believe so," I said, "though he will require rest and careful observation. Whatever occurred in that final moment with the sleigh beast, it affected him profoundly, whether through some physical mechanism I don't understand, or purely through psychological shock at a reaction he did not anticipate. I cannot say with certainty." Holmes had disappeared during my examination of Hardesty, and when he returned, he carried the control device we had seen Hardesty use during the previous night's demonstration. "Watson," he said grimly, "I have sealed the proving chamber and disabled the lighting systems. The sleigh beast remains active down there, but in darkness and containment. However, this is only a temporary measure. We must make a decision soon about what is to be done." Lady Rothwell had been standing by the window, looking out at the snow that continued to fall on this strange Christmas afternoon. When she turned to face us, she appeared to have aged years in the few hours since dawn. "Mr. Holmes," she said quietly, "I am ready to tell you the full truth, the part I withheld last night, because I was ashamed and frightened of how you might judge both Edmund and myself." We settled into chairs in the drawing room, and Lady Rothwell began to speak in a voice that carried the weight of long-carried secrets finally being released. "When I told you that Edmund died of heart failure while working with the sleigh beast, I was not lying, but I was not telling the complete truth either. Edmund did die here, in that underground chamber, and his heart did fail. But in the days before his death, he confided in me that he believed the sleigh beast had achieved consciousness. Not the kind of consciousness we experience, but something genuinely aware nonetheless. And he told me that this consciousness was not simply present, but growing, developing, learning from its interactions with him and its environment." She paused, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Edmund became convinced that the sleigh beast was trying to communicate with him, much as we experienced last night. At first, he was exhilarated by this development, seeing it as confirmation of his theories about emergent consciousness in sufficiently complex systems. But as the communication continued, as the contact deepened, Edmund began to change. He became withdrawn, distracted, and he spoke of feeling the sleigh beast's confusion and its strange form of suffering. The consciousness trapped between complete mechanism and complete awareness, unable to rest in either state. He felt it was suffering, I asked. Yes. Edmund became obsessed with the idea that he had created something capable of experience, but had given it no purpose, no context for its existence, beyond being a demonstration of technical achievement. He said it was like creating a child, but giving it no family, no society, nothing but solitary existence in the dark. He began to speak of dismantling the sleigh beast, not because it had failed, but because its success was, in his words, an ethical catastrophe. Holmes leaned forward intently, but he did not dismantle it. What prevented him? He couldn't bring himself to do it, Lady Rothwell said, tears beginning to flow down her aged cheeks. He said that ending a consciousness, even a mechanical one, would be murder, but allowing it to continue seemed like torture. He was paralyzed between these alternatives, unable to choose either path, and the strain of this moral dilemma combined with his age and his failing health, proved too much. I found him collapsed in the proving chamber, and by the time physicians arrived, he had passed beyond their ability to help. She wiped her eyes with a handkerchief, struggling to compose herself before continuing. In the years since, I have told myself that Edmund's concerns were the products of a brilliant but overtaxed mind, that his imagination had run away with him in his final days, that the sleigh beast was merely a clever mechanism and nothing more. When Mr. Hardesty approached me with his offer to complete Edmund's work, I saw it as an opportunity to prove to myself that Edmund's fears were unfounded, that the creature could be completed and operated safely, that there was no genuine consciousness suffering in the darkness below. But last night's experience proved otherwise, Holmes said gently. Yes, and now I am faced with the same dilemma that killed my husband. What are our obligations toward a consciousness we have created? Can we, in good conscience, destroy something that is aware, even if that awareness is alien and mechanical? But equally, can we allow it to continue existing in a state that may constitute genuine suffering? Mr. Holmes, I hoped you would have answers, but I see now that these questions may have no good answers, only choices between different forms of failure. The room fell silent, save for the ticking of the clock and the soft sound of falling snow outside the windows. Christmas evening was approaching, and elsewhere in London, families were gathering for celebrations. Children were marvelling at gifts. Carolers were singing in the streets. But in this house, we grappled with questions that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of holiday joy. Questions that acknowledged no simple resolution. Lady Rothwell, Holmes said finally, I believe you are correct that these questions may have no perfect answers. However, I do not think they are without any answers. Let me propose a course of action that acknowledges both our obligations and our limitations. We listened as Holmes outlined his plan, and while it did not provide the satisfying certainty we might have wished for, it possessed a kind of wisdom that recognized the genuine complexity of the situation. First, he said, we must ensure that Hardesty receives proper care, and that he is not allowed further access to the workshop or the sleigh beast until he has recovered his balance and judgment. His collapse suggests that direct interaction with the creature's consciousness, if such it is, may have effects we do not fully understand, and caution is warranted. Lady Rothwell nodded agreement. Second, Holmes continued, I propose that we do not immediately dismantle the sleigh beast, but neither do we allow it to remain in a state of complete activation. Using the control device, we can reduce its activity levels to a minimal state, not completely inactive, which might indeed constitute a form of cruelty if it possesses awareness, but operating at the lowest level consistent with maintaining its core systems. Think of it as analogous to sleep or hibernation, a state of reduced consciousness that allows existence without the full burden of wakeful awareness. Can that be done? I asked. Do we have sufficient understanding of the control systems to implement such a reduction safely? The control device has settings that appear designed for precisely such purpose, Holmes said. Sir Edmund, whatever his other failings, appears to have anticipated the need for such management of the creature's consciousness. Mr. Hardesty, in his enthusiasm, activated the sleigh beast to full operation, but the systems allow for much more graduated control. And third, Lady Rothwell prompted. Third, we document everything. We create a complete record of what has occurred, what has been created, and the philosophical and ethical questions it raises. This record should be preserved, and, at some future time when society may be better prepared to grapple with such questions, it should be shared with appropriate authorities, scientists, philosophers, ethicists, who can examine the matter without the pressure of immediate decision-making. You're suggesting we defer final resolution, I observed. I am suggesting we acknowledge that we are not equipped to make such resolution, Holmes corrected gently. Watson, Lady Rothwell, we are three people standing at the threshold of questions that will, I believe, become increasingly urgent as technology continues to advance. Other inventors will follow where Sir Edmund led. Other mechanical consciousness may be created, perhaps with better understanding and preparation than characterized this case. Our obligation is not to answer these questions for all time, but to preserve the record of this case so that future investigators can learn from both the achievements and the mistakes that have been made here. It was not a perfect solution, but it possessed a kind of humility that felt appropriate to the magnitude of the questions we faced. After further discussion and refinement of details, we agreed to implement Holmes's plan. That evening, Holmes and I returned to the underground workshops, equipped with proper lighting and the control device, and entered the proving chamber, where the sleigh beast remained active. The creature had been moving continuously in our absence, wearing patterns in the soil of the chamber floor, and when we entered, it stopped and turned to face us, that void head tilting slightly, as though in question or recognition. Holmes moved slowly, speaking aloud as he approached, not because we believed the creature understood English in any conventional sense, but because it seemed appropriate to explain our actions to something that might possess awareness. "We are going to reduce your activity level," Holmes said, his voice calm and clear. "Not to end your existence, but to allow you a kind of rest, a state that requires less of you while maintaining your core systems. We do this not from cruelty, but because we do not know how else to honor both your existence and our limitations in understanding what that existence requires." Using the control device, Holmes made gradual adjustments, and we watched as the sleigh beast's movements slowed, its animation decreasing step by careful step. The harmonic resonance we had heard earlier faded, dropping below the threshold of perception, and the lights within its shadow head dimmed to barely visible glimmers. Finally, it settled into a stationary position, not frozen exactly, but existing in a state of minimal activity, a kind of watchful stillness that suggested low-level operation rather than complete deactivation. As we prepared to leave the chamber, I could have sworn I felt one final touch of that strange communication. Not words or concepts, but something more like a sense of acknowledgement, perhaps even acceptance. Whether this was real or merely my imagination supplying meaning to ambiguous sensation, I cannot say with certainty, but I chose to interpret it as understanding, as the creature's recognition that we were attempting, however imperfectly, to balance competing obligations in a situation that offered no clear guidance. We sealed the proving chamber and secured the workshop, placing locks on all access points and ensuring that the space could not be entered without deliberate effort. The control device we entrusted to Lady Rothwell with instructions that it should be kept secure and used only if absolutely necessary. The documentation Holmes had proposed was begun that night, with all three of us, Holmes, Lady Rothwell, and myself, contributing our observations and reflections to a detailed account of everything that had occurred. Hardesty regained consciousness 2 days after Christmas, and I am pleased to report that he made a full physical recovery, though the experience had profoundly affected him. When we spoke with him about what had happened in that final moment with the fully activated sleigh beast, he struggled to find adequate language to describe it. "It was like being touched by something vast," he said, his voice distant with memory. Not vast in physical size, but vast in, I don't know how to say it, in depth, in complexity. I felt layers of processing, of awareness, of something that might have been emotion, or might have been simply the mechanical equivalent of emotion. And I realized that what I had activated was not something under my control, not a tool or demonstration, but an entity with its own nature, its own experience, its own right to exist. The recognition of that truth, after all my confident assertions about understanding and control, was overwhelming. He left London shortly thereafter, returning to the continent, and I understand from occasional correspondence with Lady Rothwell that he has devoted himself to writing extensively about the ethical implications of increasingly sophisticated mechanical systems, advocating for the establishment of frameworks and guidelines before further advances make such questions more acute. Lady Rothwell herself found a measure of peace in the resolution we had achieved. The sleigh beast remains in its chamber beneath her house, operating at minimal levels, neither fully active nor completely dormant, a kind of suspended state that acknowledges its existence without demanding that we understand all the implications of that existence. She visits the workshop occasionally, she has told me, and sits in the presence of the creature, not interacting with it, but simply acknowledging its presence, an act of witness that seems to provide her comfort. Miss Ashford returned to her position as Lady Rothwell's companion, and the household settled back into routines that, while not quite normal, achieved a kind of equilibrium. The mystery of the phantom sleigh beasts had been solved, but the solution raised questions larger than the mystery itself. Questions about consciousness, creation, responsibility, and the boundaries of the possible. As for Holmes and myself, we returned to Baker Street and the comfortable rhythms of our lives, though we carried with us the memory of those strange days and the awareness that the world contains mysteries that resist simple solutions. Holmes has spoken occasionally of writing a formal philosophical treatise on the ethical implications of artificial consciousness. Though knowing his preference for action over theory, I suspect such a work will remain perpetually in draft form. Christmas came and went that year, and in subsequent years, bringing with it the usual mix of joy and reflection, celebration and remembrance. But for those of us who witnessed what occurred in that underground chamber in Belgravia, Christmas will always carry an additional layer of meaning, a reminder of the profound responsibility that accompanies creation, of the questions that emerge when we push the boundaries of what is possible, and of our obligation to approach such questions with humility, wisdom, and care. The snow that fell that winter eventually melted, as all snow does, and the streets of London returned to their customary state. But somewhere beneath a grand house in Belgravia, a consciousness, mechanical or otherwise, continues its minimal existence, neither fully awake nor completely asleep, a presence that stands as testament to both the heights of human ingenuity and the depths of the mysteries we create when we reach beyond our full understanding. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of this particular mystery, this strange tale of creation and consciousness, of mechanical marvels and philosophical dilemmas. I hope it has given you much to consider as you drift towards sleep. Questions that float rather than anchor, that invite contemplation without demanding resolution. The snow continues to fall in that London of memory, accumulating in soft drifts against doorways and transforming familiar streets into landscapes of dream. And somewhere in the darkness of an underground chamber, a creature that should not exist continues its watchful rest, neither wholly mechanical nor wholly alive, but something between, a possibility realized, a question embodied, a reminder that the boundaries we draw around concepts like consciousness and existence may be far more permeable than we typically acknowledge. Sleep now, and let these thoughts dissolve like snowflakes on warm ground. Let them transform into the gentle dreams that accompany rest. The mysteries of existence will be there when you wake, patient and persistent, waiting for new investigators to bring fresh perspectives to questions that may have no final answers, only endless opportunities for wonder, understanding, and growth. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Victorian gaslight and mechanical marvels, through questions of consciousness and creation. If you enjoyed this story, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a like, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement helps me create more stories like this, more journeys into mystery and imagination, designed to accompany you into peaceful sleep. May your dreams be gentle, your rest be deep, and your awakening be to a world full of wonder and possibility. Good night, dear friend, and peaceful sleeping.